chairs, just want to say that this is a public meeting, and we do have members of the public both online and in the room with us. We're not taking public comments today, but we do have an online portal where folks can submit comments, and Soberfine is going to drop that link in the chat in just a moment. And with that, I will turn it over to Linda and Dan and Ken to give us a welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks. Let's begin with Kim, our very gracious host here at the Island Institute. Thanks for having us here today, Kim.
You are welcome, Linda. Well, I just wanted to say a few words of welcome from the Island Institute perspective and share a couple of things that we're seeing. This meeting comes at a great time. We're in the middle of a strategy refresh, and we're beginning to do some work on sort of the from to that we're seeing in different communities. And there were three that jumped out to me in the context of this meeting that I thought I might share just very quickly. One of the from tos that we're seeing is the movement from institutions to infrastructure in communities. So movement from just supporting the fundamental institutions to really thinking about what's the infrastructure like broadband, climate resiliency, clean energy to support those communities. The second from two is moving from contained challenges to collaborative challenges. So from problems that communities can solve themselves to problems that really need a joint effort. And what we heard today, I think in the Rockland Harbor is enigmatic of that. The third one is really preservation to adaptation. So from how do we preserve communities as we know them today to thinking about how do we put in the fundamental building blocks so we can plan for tomorrow. And so those are fairly, I think, significant shifts that we're hearing from the communities that we serve in particular. And in response to some of this, we've now changed and updated our mission statement. So for those of you who are less familiar with Island Institute, our mission is to boldly navigate climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to expand opportunities and to deliver solutions. So as we go into this, we're thinking the challenges are important, but the solutions are just as important. So really coming at this with a solutions mindset is really important. And in terms of the vision, really thinking about island and coastal communities as examples of innovation. And so looking at how can we lead the country, looking at the work that's happening in these communities. And then specifically on the climate resilience work, we've all known climate was going to be an issue for a while, but the storms really amped that up in the communities that we serve. I think many of you know we moved pretty quickly with a small grants program, some technical assistance in the aftermath. I would say those early grants were incredibly important, but they were really just a drop in the bucket compared to the resources that are needed in those communities. So this is why we are so grateful to the state for the Infrastructure Adaptation Fund, why we wanted to advocate on behalf of that and to really make sure that small businesses all along the coast are taking advantage of that. So very appreciative of that work and very much looking forward to the work coming out of this particular working group to help inform what we're doing. Just simply say, we want to support this work, be a partner with you, and welcome to Island Institute.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I think that your renewed focus on solutions is a very good fit for this particular commission, very solution oriented. So it's really nice to hear that. And thanks for all the years of service. Island Institute colleagues in the room as well, who as a coastal community person I have dealt with over the years, and we appreciate all your years of service and support of our island and coastal communities. Thanks again for hosting us. We've had some more commission members pop into our virtual screen, and I think because there are more of us in the room than usual, it'd be nice to just go around the room really quickly, just say your name, agency or town or place you're from. We'll start with Co-Chair Dan.
Co-Chair Dan. From Port Clyde, just down the road.
Pat Kelleher, the DMR Commissioner. Chris Valen, Director of Ports and Marine Infrastructure for Maine DOT.
Brian Ambrett with GoPIF and policy staff for the commission.
I'm Maggie Kelly Boyd, also with GoPIF, also staff support for the commission. Hi, Hannah Silverfine, also staff support, technical support for this commission.
Kurt Brown, Washington from Cape Elizabeth, and marine biologist at Ready Seafood.
Jim East, Bureau Director, Resource Information Land Use Planning at DACF, in for Commissioner Maine.
Joyce Taylor, Chief Engineer, Maine DOT.
Jim Knauer, Prop Marine. Bob Carey, Superintendent of Insurance.
Jack Parker from Legal Aid.
Emily Rabi, Executive Director, Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission.
Lynn Kennedy, intern for Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission.
Heather Johnson, I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development.
Noel Wu, State Director for ARP Maine.
Hannah Pingree, Director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and Future. Go if, as you heard from.
And I'm Linda Nelson. I'm the other co-chair of the commission, and I am the Economic and Community Development Director for the town of Stonington. And we have at least a half dozen commission members online. Pete, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Peter Slavinsky, marine geologist, Maine Geological Survey.
Thank you. Two Pete's. Pete number two.
Number two, Pete Rogers. I'm the director for the Maine Emergency Management Agency.
Thank you. Sam?
Sam Roy, New England Water Science Center, USGS.
Joe?
Joe Purington with Central Maine Power.
Deborah?
Deborah Elwood, Maine Community Foundation.
And Dan?
Dan Burgess, Director of the Governor's Energy Office.
Maybe.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thanks to everybody on screen for introducing yourselves. We have guests in the room with us today, too, so we're just going to go quickly around the back of the room here and have you introduce yourselves, starting by the director.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Fagan from the Instagram.
Glenn Prickett, Gulf of Maine Research Institute.
Melissa Roy, North Lake County.
Sarah Curran, Deputy Director for Climate Planning and Community Partnerships.
Just at Institute.
Leslie Bates Seabury.
Sam Brody, Texas A&M University Institute for Disaster Resilient Texas. It's great to see everyone in person. I couldn't stay away.
Deirdre Gilbert, Director of State Marine Policy at DMR.
Tom Avello, Deputy Chief of Staff for Hill Mills.
Olivia Richards, Island Institute.
Sam Belknap, I direct the Island Institute Center for the Marine Economy.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, everybody. What a great group. I'm sure we're going to have a very lively discussion this afternoon. And, our purpose here is to really begin considering what our recommendations are in regard to the ongoing recovery and resilience of our working waterfront infrastructure. This, of course, for me, coming from Stonington, is a topic that is seriously, if not near and dear to my heart, like my heart. So I'm like right with this. And it's really, we're talking about long-term protections, right, of some working waterfronts in general, from pressures that are not just about natural disasters, but also competing uses and redevelopment and disrepair. And I will talk more about that later. Our working waterfronts and the issues that are facing them today are intricate. They're really complicated. And for those of you who were just on the walk with us and got to hear Julie from the town of Rockland talk, you got to hear kind of the full panoply of like all the intersecting issues of a large and active working waterfront. So today we're going to begin our meeting with important contextual information. So we're going to start with the Department of Marine Resources, the Marine Climate Council, and the Working Waterfront Coalition to give us some context for our talks. And then, as we did just 2 weeks ago, we're going to follow those preparations with a panel from our own commission members, as well as several experts from the industry. And we'll have a facilitated conversation among commission members about potential recommendations. So really kind of being focused on what are the recommendations that are becoming top of mind at this point in our work that are actionable. And I'm going to hand it over back to Dan Tishman to take us from here.
Thanks, Linda. So we have a packed schedule today, and I've been assured that by Julie Hassan that we shouldn't be terribly worried if our meters run out in parking or the end of the meeting, because they're still in training wheels. But I'll leave it to each one to figure out whether that's something you want to break away to do, recharge the meter. Anyway, Linda, thank you, and Kim of the Island Institute. As I mentioned to Kim earlier, I spent many years in the Island Institute boards and years ago, and it was probably one of the things that helped me frame my thoughts around the importance of not only coastal island communities, but coastal communities writ large in the state, and how fragile they were and how complicated the issues that face them are. And, there's a direct line from many hours in this room to sitting here today. So I thank the Island Institute for helping me understand critical nature of this part of Maine. Earlier this morning, we met with Julie from the city of Rockland. I can really say that Julie represents, you know, a real gem for the town of Rockland. Really forward thinking, kind of really completely understands the issues, struggling, as we have heard so often, with, you know, kind of knowing what the right direction is, but not knowing how to get there, especially around funding, permitting, you know, just a reaffirmation of many of the topics that we've talked about before. Julie also, for me, represented the vast delta between communities that have capacity and communities that don't. And we've been in many communities that don't have the Julies, don't have anything that nearly approaches the Julies, and we understand the difficulty that Rockland has sort of making the future that they have envisioned happen, but those communities outside of Rockland, or whether they're on the coast or inland, you know, it's a complete mystery of how they take themselves into the future. I think it's a great opportunity for us to deal with that. So much of as Lynn said, much of the discussion today will be around supporting the fishing related working waterfronts. But we have to remember that the commission should keep the larger perspective of waterfronts in mind. And, you know, we go back to the conversation with Julie this morning, and she did a great job of sort of defining how this multifaceted waterfront that is, in her mind, a working waterfront, and literally drives the economy of this, not only this town, but the central mid-coast region. At our meeting 2 weeks ago, Hannah Pingree teased for us a significant funding announcement that would happen just a few days later relative to our work. And on July 26th, Governor Mills, with our congressional delegation, welcomed the news that the federal government is investing $69 million into resiliency in Maine. Through our recommendations, the commission will have the opportunity to shape the ways this funding is advanced. This funding advances resiliency in our coastal and inland communities. To tell us a little bit about this award, I'd ask Sarah Corin from GoPIP to provide the commission an overview of the grant's activities. Sarah.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just gonna join you at the table for a moment. So this is a really exciting grant announcement that we were able to announce last Friday with NOAA and lots of representatives from the delegation and the governor's office. It is a huge investment in climate resilience in Maine, almost $70 million. It is a 5-year grant and represents collaboration across multiple agencies with lots of external partners. Really, really exciting and significant step forward in climate resilience for the state. It really builds on the momentum around Maine Won't Wait and the governor's leadership and moves a lot of things forward. I also wanted to emphasize that it comes on the heels of significant state investments as well. So the $60 million that the governor proposed and the legislature approved, and the working waterfront grants that came out the same week as the NOAA announcement. So I want to just briefly describe the NOAA grant, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? Thanks, Sarah. There's 3 major components of the grant. The first is really a focus on capacity and funding of local projects for climate resilience. And this, I think, really resonates well with a lot of what Julie was saying this morning around the need for communities both to have, you know, really big projects they need to invest in. They're pursuing multiple funding opportunities. They're trying to stack it all together, and the need for that kind of flexible funding that will support their ability to leverage federal grants, as well as the capacity to help them go after those federal grants. And so there's significant investment in this NOAA proposal to capitalize the Community Resilience Partnership, which is the grants program for climate and energy action that GoPIF runs, where communities are eligible for up to $50,000 to take climate and energy actions that are in alignment with the state's climate action plan, Maine Won't Wait. So it puts $9 million into the Community Resilience Partnership for grants to communities. It also really invests in the regional planning organizations and other trusted partners that do the hand-holding with those communities. So the other aspect of that grant program is we give grants to service providers to help communities determine their priorities, make a plan to implement them, and go after their first grant to go after that most important project. And so this grant also puts money continuing to provide that support from those regional planning organizations and nonprofit partners. So that's really, really important. It puts more money into the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund at DOT, at almost $20 million, and $7 million of that for working waterfront investments. So continuing to leverage that really important tool at DOT for making those infrastructure projects happen in local communities. The second part of it is really focused on nature-based solutions. So a lot of emphasis on agency collaboration and support for getting some of those nature-based solutions projects up and going, and getting some really robust Maine examples of how things like salt marshes and other nature-based solutions can help us deal with climate impacts. So that's a really important focus of this as well. And then finally, a real emphasis on strengthening the resiliency of working waterfronts. So importantly for the conversation today, positions at both Maine Coastal Program and Sea Grant to support technical assistance and support for working waterfront communities, as well as building on the work that Sea Maine has done in terms of economic resilience, some needs assessment and grants for energy efficiency, thinking about the economic resilience of working waterfronts as well. So again, a huge investment in climate resilience in Maine, $69 million, 5 years with a focus on these 3 areas, on community capacity and targeted investments in infrastructure, on nature-based solutions, and then significantly on working waterfronts. Funding starts to flow on October 1st, and we're really looking forward to working with all of our state agency and other partners to move this money as quickly as possible and get this technical assistance up. And anything you want to add?
I think Sarah has covered it well. I think the only thing maybe, Sarah is now sitting next to Rob, who's here from Maine DEP, and the grant has, this is not particular to working waterfront, but a variety of funding opportunities for other state agencies, DEP, folks at Judy's shop. Do you want to talk about some of those, only because I think they'll become relevant to the mission just down the road, maybe tease them, but not go into details?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is around sort of how state agencies work together and how they work to support climate resilience at the local level. So updating regulations, updating tools and resources, how agencies sort of tackle a geography together and look at how goals can be moved forward collaboratively. So there's a lot of emphasis in the grant on kind of getting the state's house in order as well, so that we're a good partner to local projects, and also doing things like having best practices to share, having resources to share, really coming to the table to help move a lot of these solutions forward.
Great. So we'll keep talking, I'm sure, to this commission about this $69 million. It's a big deal. It's 5 years of capacity funding, 5 years of funding. It's which is all awesome news. And so I think, again, I think as Dan said, I think this commission can help us think about how to best use it. That being said, we talked about some dollar amounts. I mean, $20 million for infrastructure adaptation is not a lot of money. So I actually think we're thinking about these funds as like they're becoming more precious. How do we ensure that we are utilizing them to have the most maximum impact? Julie talked this morning about leveraging federal funds. So to the extent that state funds can help communities with planning, they can then leverage a variety of infrastructure funds, congressionally directed spending funds. That is what's needed, because while 69 million is a lot over 5 years, it's sort of the beginning of how we do this work in a more long-term way. I think what's the word we use, Sarah, repeatedly in the grant that we hope to become a exemplar,
a national leader in climate resilience.
Yeah, and I would say this grant is one of just 2 large grants on the East Coast. Just Maine and New Jersey got big grants. There were only 8 in the country. So I think we all know Maine has a ton of work to do, but it's really a big deal I'm very proud of Sarah and the GoPIF team, but really so many partners, including lots around the table who helped us get it. And now we want all your help to spend it as wisely as possible. So.
Thank you, Sarah. It's an exciting development. Keep hearing about money. So now there is a little bit of money that'll really help us be able to hone in on the outcomes of our committee's report, both in the fall and the spring. And we look forward to hearing about more successful grants. I know this was a heavy lift, and how we can leverage this for other things. Now we're going to transition to a number of short presentations to provide background information on the working waterfront infrastructure. Somewhat of a follow-on of what we heard from Julie this morning relative to Rockland. First, we'll hear from the Commissioner of Marine Department of the Department of Marine Resources, Pat Kelleher, who is also a member of this commission. Commissioner Kelleher will provide an overview of the importance of working waterfront for Maine's coastal communities and the challenges that working waterfronts are facing along the coast. Next, we'll hear from Deirdre Gilbert, the Director of Industry Programs at Maine Department of Marine Resources, about existing programs that support working waterfront in Maine, including the recovery fund recently announced by DMR for rebuilding. Then Kurt Brown, a fisherman, co-chair of the Maine Climate Council and Marine Working Group and a member of this commission, will give us an overview of the working waterfront infrastructure focused recommendations that the working group recommended to the Climate Council, so that our recommendations can be informed by and supportive of the work that is going on by the Climate Council. Lastly, we'll hear from Nick Batista and Gail. Gail, I'm gonna Gail on behalf of Gail Z on behalf of the Maine Working Waterfront Coalition. Nick is the Island Institute's Chief Policy Officer. Gail is the Director of the Marine Sea Grant Program at the University of Maine. Both the Island Institute and Sea Grant provide convening and leadership support to the Working Waterfront Coalition. After the presentations, we're going to have a robust Q&A from commission members.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to just go over a handful of slides here, kind of talk about some of the things that we're dealing with, and kind of leave you with a bunch of question marks, leave the commission with a bunch of question marks, I think, as far as what we need to talk about long term. First, just to highlight the importance of working waterfront in Maine. Last year, we had $611 million in landed value, and that's ex-vessel value. So that's what is sold coming across the dock. So when you put a conservative economic multiplier to our fisheries, that comes out to well over $1.5 billion in economic activity up and down the coast. Maine DMR licenses about 10,000 individuals. Those are harvesters, processors, dealers, and then we also support about 35,000 direct and indirect jobs here in coastal Maine. That certainly highlights the importance of our commercial fisheries here and our working waterfront. Next slide. It was interesting listening to Julie talk about kind of the diversity here in Rockland. But from Maine DMR standpoint, we actually have defined in statute, we have a definition for working waterfront. It's working waterfront or working waterfront property means land legally, and I don't have my glasses on because I left them in my truck. So I think that says filled of filed lands and piers, wharves, and other improvement to lands adjacent to the navigable coastal waters of the state of Maine used by commercial fisheries business. When we say commercial fisheries business, we include aquaculture in that as well. So next slide. So over the course of the last really several years, even before the storms, there's been a lot of focus on working waterfront. on the coast of Maine. We obviously have the Land for Maine Future program, which Dee will talk more about. But the storm certainly have highlighted this need for working waterfront. Working waterfront to me are range from family-owned piers, such as the pier that you see here, which is in my family, which is now gone based on the storms. And so I do want to give a shout out based on talking to my cousins, a big shout out to the Island Institute because they certainly helped them. But that pier, if you're familiar with Casco Bay, that pier was built with timbers off Jules Island from the old World War II facilities that were off Jules Island that had fallen in. They collected that material and built that wharf when I was a kid. So they built that almost 50 years ago. And it stood the test of time up until this last storm. And now they're building bigger and higher and still using those piers because they all washed up into the boat cove, up into the woods, and they were able to collect a lot of them. We won't talk DEPs here, so we won't talk about permit. But obviously the focus here, we need to have focus because I was in a conversation not too long ago when we were talking about working waterfront. One of the people that I was talking to talked about, well, don't forget, we've got all this inland property that supports commercial fishing. Right? And I think if we start diluting ourselves away from the coast, I think that makes it much harder. So that's why I continue to say we need to remain focused on kind of more in line with the statute, but then thinking about the footprint of what you saw this morning, the boat yards, the tourist components, and those other pieces that make up working waterfront versus the commercial working waterfront. Obviously, we must make sure it's resilient, accessible is critical, and then protect against conversion. And you'll hear a little bit about that from Deidre, but the threat to conversion is real and made very real after COVID. Next slide. So challenges. Taking public money and investing public money in private infrastructure posed a challenge. This was part of the conversation that Hannah and I and others had at the legislature with the Appropriations Committee. And that's why with the money that we just allocated to working waterfront, why you saw a 1-to-1 match component to have the private entities have skin in the game, so to speak. So that does make it very difficult. It was the #1 complaint we had because it was the investment had to have a public benefit, and I think we with DOT and GoPIF have done that. But at the same time, those small family wharfs or wharfs that have maybe a very small business were like, hey, what about us? And I think that really kind of highlights the challenge we'll have with the money that's coming in through GoPIF and the money that we have thanks to the appropriations from Senator Collins, trying to think about what the next round of spending is going to look like. The one thing that I have had a lot of conversations with fishermen about is that family wharf that needs help. In a lot of cases, they don't need help with money. My family example is a good one where they've got the materials, but they need help with engineering and permitting. And so how can we potentially invest in that to think about getting this money on the ground? How can we help in whether it's a regional or a community level? I'm not sure, but I think it's something that the commission needs to wrestle with. And then this picture, which is obviously not Maine based on those 20-foot and 25-foot wide lobster boats that you see there. That is from the Inner Bay of Fundy on the New Brunswick side. And the drove all around Bay of Fundy and up into Nova Scotia and up onto Cape Breton Island. And what was very different about those facilities, not that they didn't have smaller private or family-owned wharves, the communities had a big focus on a municipal presence or a municipal wharf. Those are nearly 60-foot lobster boats that are 25-foot wide, so you got to get a scale not only of the tide, but of the size of that facility. And if you notice the tire tracks in the mud there, those, well, interestingly, I should have put the other picture in. Interestingly, those tire tracks were from dump trucks and excavators that were just dredging out around, which they do every 2 to 3 years, as just part of routine maintenance of the facility. DEP, think about that a little bit. Next slide, please. Hannah asked me to touch on flood insurance a little bit. I'm not aware of a single successful claim in those last storms with flood insurance as it pertained to commercial sites. These 2 sites were family-owned sites that obviously were devastated, one in Harpswell and one down by 5 Islands. No flood insurance, no way to rebuild. Not only did they lose the infrastructure, thousands of dollars of damage to the traps that were also there, some lost, some just damaged. So as my second bullet says, flood insurance, it's too damn expensive. I heard that over and over and over again. Some businesses did carry flood insurance as part of their banknotes that they had as they were dealing with financing. But as soon as those were cleared up, they dropped it like a hot potato. They were spending $30,000 to $60,000 for flood insurance, and they just said, "I'm just going to put the money away if that's what I've got to do." So, how do we overcome this in the face of sea level rise? We need to build a resistance. And the flood insurance question, it's a big one, and I don't know how to solve it. Right, it's a federal issue, and it's one that is real. But in the face of climate change, I don't know how a small family business or even a mid-scale or large-scale business can afford it in the long term. Next slide. This is, I wish you could see the sky beyond it, because this is when I flew over New Harbor in between the 2 storms. It's hard to see the damage here in New Harbor, but it was devastating up and down that right-hand shoreline. And this really just is an example of the amazing work that the towns did. That the town had dump trucks, excavators on barges, brought in, I don't know how many different different contractors, and had most of it cleaned up by the time I got there 2 days later. It was really amazing to see. Now, the rebuild obviously is going to take a lot longer, but it is moving in the right direction. But some of the things that I think we as a commission need to think about around infrastructure is the inventory of working waterfront. And I would say, what does that mean? Because it means a lot of things to a lot of people. Not only inventory about what's existing, but really, Deidre had a conversation with somebody, a local legislator the other day. It's like, well, we need to know what working waterfront's going to be in 50 years. Should we be protecting something that could become working waterfront? And that just made my mind explode. That's somebody else can worry about that one. But the advanced planning is key. This grant that the state just got is going to be critical to that. And then one of the other questions that came up a lot was the procurement of materials and having contractors ready. It's nice to have 2 major contractors on this commission here, but I don't even know how to go about procurement of materials up front, not knowing exactly what we need. But the amount of pilings that I've seen come in on tractor trailers, I don't think you drive down 95 and you don't see a truck coming north with wood on it, with treated, and a lot of treated pilings. So we need one plan though, and I'm hoping this commission will help really focus everybody on what that plan is going to be. If we start separating, and diluting our efforts, it's going to be difficult. And I think this is my next slide, is the last slide. I mean, you've all heard that, right? I mean, the threat to conversion. Is this your slide?
No, it's yours.
This might. I don't know where it was from. So the threat to conversion, The demographic challenges are very real, again, since COVID and the changes we're seeing. Every time I talk to Kathleen down at Stonington, I'm just amazed at how Stonington has changed, and that's just one example. Obviously, changes in fisheries is real. It's happening. Everything we deal with at the Department of Marine Resources on the fish side is driven by climate change, and so we will see change in fisheries, and we have to be recognizing that our working waterfront needs to adapt to those things. And then the workforce housing issue is one that always comes up. And I'm hoping that's my last slide. Let's go to the next one. I have two more. One, huh? That's my last one. Okay, so this is we have to be thinking about what the new normal is. And those challenges that are listed there between engineering, permitting, and materials, I think are really need to be one of our major focuses, especially as we start thinking about these smaller facilities that are going to need help, especially with those top two boards. So with that, Dan, I will end my presentation. And if anybody has a question, we can just have Deidre jump right in.
I think we'll hold questions till the end. Rely on you. She's going closer to the slides so she can see.
I could put my dark glasses on right up there.
Well, Deirdre's getting set up, the folks in the room can just speak a little bit louder so the mics can pick it up.
Okay, so my role is to speak in a little bit more detail about some of the state programs and grants that we've been running recently, so you can kind of see the range of what we have been working on. There are really 5 that I'm going to touch on today. The first one is those working waterfront resilience grants that have been mentioned a couple times, and that was a joint effort between DMR, DOT, and GoPIF. So Chris and Maggie both worked on that in terms of the application process and project selection. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is actually, it's been referenced a couple times that this opportunity was proposed by the governor. She originally had proposed standalone legislation to fund this effort. It ended up getting done through the supplemental budget. And the Appropriations Committee, as Pat referenced, they provided some additional guidance in the language that ultimately passed. But I've just kind of highlighted some of the key parts of what we were given to work with. So this program was for public infrastructure with a particular exception for private infrastructure that provided a significant and compelling community benefit, such as working waterfront. We defined working waterfront for the sake of this program to mean the wharves and the piers that support commercial fishing and aquaculture. So that's what we were really focused on, that particular infrastructure. In terms of funding a project, the proposal had to increase the resilience of the property to future storm and flooding impacts, and we took a pretty pragmatic approach to what that meant. DOT provided a lot of guidance on the different types of strategies that we would consider sufficient to meet that requirement. And then I already mentioned that compelling community benefit, and we were trying to really focus on properties that weren't served by FEMA and weren't successful in their insurance claims, which, as the commissioner said, was pretty much everyone. Next slide. So one of the initial kind of threshold criteria was that these properties had to have been damaged in this past winter storms. We had $25 million available. As Pat mentioned, that was with a 1-to-1 match requirement. We set some basic threshold eligibility criteria. So for that significant and compelling community benefit, we decided that the threshold would be that the property had to serve at least 10 commercial license holders or growers. We really struggled when we were kind of designing the application where to set that number. We initially thought about starting at 20 and then doing a subsequent round if we had funds left over. I actually think it was Brian who suggested, why don't you just go to 10 and tell folks we're going to focus on that 20 and above level, and if we have funds, we'll drop back down. As it turned out, that worked out perfectly because we opened our grant application on May 9th, and we gave folks a month to do the application, so everything was due on June 10th. We received 80 applications, and that total pool of applications almost exactly totaled $25 million, or right in that ballpark. As it turned out, there were 68 applications that we determined were eligible in terms of the level of use and the nature of the use. So we were able to fund all eligible projects that we received in that program. It was 21.2 million in those initial awards, and we made those on July 12th. Since that time, Chris has been doing all of the work kind of subsequent to the allocation, setting up the contracts with the successful property owners. DOT is administering that in a manner that's similar to their locally administered projects program, or whatever they call that. But basically how these funds will flow is through the municipality in which the projects are located. So that's actually who DOT contracts with, is with the town. And they provide, they serve a role in kind of confirming that the project actually has been completed, in addition to the invoices and stuff that DOT looks at, but they kind of make sure that the work actually got done. So that is kind of where we stand with that program. Next slide.
What did you say the range of grant sizes?
Sure, I was thinking about that this weekend. So really endearingly, we got an application that was for like $3,000, right?
$3,800.
$3,800 on Long Island, in Castaway. And on the upper end, $2 million was the most that we were going to award to any one project. And we made, I want to say 4 $2 million awards. 3 of those were in Portland. So this is kind of the range of project locations. As you can see, from one end of the coast to the other, the storms hit pretty much everywhere. There was a pretty good concentration of projects in Stonington and in Harpswell. I think those were the towns with the most. Millbridge was kind of right behind in terms of number of projects. And then Portland, as I said, only 4 projects, but it's $6.5 million of what we allocated. So kind of a big concentration of funds there. So there's a little bit of money left over from that program. We've had a couple of different thoughts about how that could get used. DOT was also running another infrastructure program at the same time that I think was oversubscribed and could potentially absorb some of that. We've been talking about the fact that it's helpful to have some funds in contingency because the projects that we received were like a really broad range of completely done, and this is exactly what it costs, to I'd like to do this. I've had somebody come down and give me a really rough estimate, but that may or may not be enough at the end of the day. So some money for contingency, and then it's been referenced a couple times. In addition to this 25 million, there's another $10 million in federal funding that Senator Collins secured, that DMR needs to write a spend plan for those funds in order to get that allocated. That's kind of a work in progress. It's another area, like Hannah mentioned, where if this commission could provide some input into these rare opportunities to invest, pretty significant money into Maine's working waterfront, what is the best way to do that? And we've had some ideas, but obviously interested in your thoughts on that. So a couple other grant programs that have been around a lot longer and are ongoing.
I just have one question. Is there going to be an audit function after the fact to make sure that the money was actually spent?
For the resilience grants?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to let Chris speak to that.
Yeah, there will be. So in the process of putting all of these eligible projects into the DOT work system called projects, we have set up so that it's a searchable title for this exact grant program. And in the finance department, it'll be fully auditable, utilizing this title for municipality or even entity. So if there's questions in the future about when did an invoice get submitted, when was it paid, all the way down to how much and for what, it should all be traceable through the audit process of DOT.
Yeah, I was thinking actually at this one higher level, and that's actually on the ground, did it yield the resilient results that we would like it?
So that's part of the municipal partnership, and it's part of the initial application review of the scope of work for each project. So each project was taken, the scope of work presented. I did some ground truthing and some digging into some projects we had some questions about. But they all met our threshold of what resiliency meant in terms of rebuilding the waterfront to a better state than it was prior to the storms. And in a pragmatic approach, making it an affordable and economical resiliency solution was very important. So within that, you know, heavier, higher, basic tie down functions, you know, how old was the pier to begin with, newer timbering schemes, things like that were taken into account.
And I did want to mention, we had a pretty quick turnaround on those applications, and both the Island Institute and the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association provided support for applicants to get applications in, which was really critical in terms of the applications that we did get. I think that was a huge service that was provided that made that timeline possible. So moving on to other grant programs, the Shore and Harbor Planning Grants, those are available through the Maine Coastal Program at DMR. And that program has been around for over 20 years. That is like a planning, granting program for municipalities to kind of position them to be able to take advantage of other sources of funding. I was talking with Melissa Britch, who administers that, on the way down. This most recent round, in my involvement with that program in the past, I felt like the applications they were receiving were kind of commensurate with the amount of money they had to give out, which is roughly a couple $100,000 annually. She had mentioned for the past 3 years, they've had more need than available funds. And we were talking about why that might be. And obviously, I think everybody is recognizing the need that, you know, the need for planning is higher than it has ever been. And then Chris also administers a program at DOT for the Small Harbor Improvement Program. That's $250,000 up to $250,000.
Yeah, it's funded at, it actually this year was increased, the size of it doubled from 500,000 to $1 million per year. But $250,000 is the project asked total, the grant total per project.
And that's for municipal infrastructure.
Yep, that's for municipal infrastructure that increases access and usage of the waterfront, whether it be boat launches and fish piers to, you know, public wharves and landings.
And Judy has identified a program that I.
Yes, just because we coordinated it this year, the coastal community grants. This year, Melissa and the municipal planning program in my shop, they worked together and issued that program statement together. So they are the planning grants to get the engineering done, the designs and so on. Just a little bit more there. It's not a lot.
Right.
Okay, next slide. So those are the granting programs relative to working waterfront. The other program I want to talk about is the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program, which is not actually a grant per se. It's a program that the department has been running since 2006. And the purpose of the program is to provide protection to strategically significant working waterfront properties whose continued availability to commercial fishing and aquaculture businesses is essential to the long-term future of the economic sector. So what we are actually doing in this program is purchasing the development rights associated with the working waterfront properties. So that property cannot be developed in a way that would make its use inconsistent with commercial fishing or aquaculture uses. Similar to kind of a conservation easement, we put what's called a working waterfront covenant on that property. DMR is the holder of the covenant. It gets recorded in the registry of deeds. It follows the property in perpetuity. It kind of is a forever encumbrance on the property. That means it can't be developed for other uses. To figure out what we will pay for that covenant, we have an appraisal done, or the applicant has an appraisal done.
where they look at what's the value of the property if you could do anything with it, and then what's the value of the property if you could only use it for commercial fishing and aquaculture. That difference is the value of the covenant. We will pay up to 50% of the, we'll pay the value of the covenant up to 50% of the appraised value of the property. We have been in a situation where appraisers don't find any covenant value, particularly in eastern Maine, where the highest and best use is commercial fishing. So we'll pay 25% of the appraised value of the property in that case. So it tends to be kind of in that range, 25 to 50% of the appraised value of the property is what the covenant is worth and what we will pay to encumber it. In addition to the covenant, the state also obtains a right of first refusal. So when these properties change hands, the owner has to, or when they're proposed to change hands, they have to notify the Department of Marine Resources. We look at who's buying the property. We're trying to make sure that that is an entity that's going to use it for commercial fishing purposes. If we have any question about that, we could substitute a different buyer if we could find one who is going to use it in the way that we're looking for the properties to be used. So that's another important piece of this program. We like to say this is for both accessibility and affordability of working waterfronts. Over time, like I mentioned, this started in 2006. DMR has been the only holder of covenants. There was a recent law change that the Island Institute worked on to broaden the types of entities that can hold these covenants. That only happened a little over a year or so ago. I'd say people are still trying to figure out how exactly that's going to work, but if that provides another avenue for properties to be protected that doesn't involve DMR holding those covenants, that's great news for us. If other people can act differently or more nimbly, we're happy to see that happen. Next slide.
Deirdre, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Oh, maybe this is it. I was going to ask how many properties were
Yes.
protected in that
Yes.
way, right?
So we, like I said, we started doing this in 2006. We're up to 30 properties. We just ran around this past winter. I would say having the resiliency grants open at the same time had what I've been calling a chilling effect on people wanting to sell us their covenants, because there was another source of money that they could access that didn't have this, pretty serious string attached of the covenant. So I know at least 2 properties that talked to us about the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program ended up just applying for resiliency grants. Stonington Co-op actually applied to both, which was like my best case scenario. They already had a covenant on Co-op 1, they're putting a covenant on Co-op 2. But co-ops are the bread and butter of this program. They are like kind of the no-brainer properties that make sense to be encumbered by covenants. So we've got covenants on 12 co-op properties, 4 family wharves, a historical society owned wharf, land trusts, municipally owned wharves, nonprofits, and private businesses. We've been tracking kind of the area and the number of boats that are impacted by that, number of fishermen. So we're up to almost 45 acres, almost 9,000 feet of shorefront, over 1,000 boats, almost 2,000 fishermen whose access has been protected in this program. That's Alex. Great.
Have you been in a situation yet where one of the east properties has now gone on the market?
Yes, we probably had, I would say maybe 5 or 6 properties change hands after they were encumbered with a covenant. We haven't had to intercede in those sales in terms of the ones that have occurred so far. The folks who've been buying them have been using them for commercial fishing, so we have let those transactions happen.
Probably one thing to point out on that program, because it comes up on the element board a lot, is that, well, let's tell them how we want this money used, but don't forget, we're the state buying something. We don't tell them how to use that money, right? And so a lot of people have thought about this program as a way to drive resiliency, but think it would be a very difficult conversation. I don't think we would see any applications if we were telling them this, but I will say that for the most part, all of the money goes back into the property that we've seen. Probably a couple of vacations.
Commissioner, I just wanted to let you know, one thing that I heard in Beals, when you did the Beals project, that was quite a while ago. One of the things they did choose to do was to raise the power lines so they could get the boats out of the water fast, which I thought was a really elegant solution to, and a resilient solution to getting out of harm's way. So they chose to do that, and I think it was just really wise. I just thought it was super innovative. So I think they know what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, Miller's Wharf and Tennis Tower is another great example, right? I mean, Tennis Tower had a lot of damage.
Yeah.
Miller's had hardly any, just because they had just made that investment.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks to the Island Institute for hosting us. This is such a great room. I think one of my favorite meetings every year is the climate roundtable meeting we have right here in this room, where it's a group of fishermen talking about how things change year to year, not necessarily under the guise of climate change, but that's what everyone is talking about. It's a really wonderful meeting right in this space. So very much appreciated that we're all here today, speaking on behalf of the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Climate Council. But if you're in this room and we're on the working group, can you please raise your hand? Excellent. So any questions can be directed that way. Carl Wilson, who was my co-chair, couldn't make it today either, so you're stuck with me, unfortunately. But I'll make it quick here. This was a really dynamic group. We had an all-star team of individuals with all kinds of different areas of expertise. And when we started, I'd say less than a year ago at this point in time, we kind of wandered for a little bit trying to find out what our cause was, because it wasn't just reduce emissions or install this or do that. It was more of a broad array of options that we were looking at, and we made it through November and December with actually a few decent storms, don't get me wrong, but then in January we really found our mission within a week. Between the 10th and the 13th storms, I think our mission became very clear very quickly, and everything we're talking about and doing today really is a result of that and a lot of the work we did. So I'll fly through these slides and then we can touch on more questions and answers so we can stay on schedule throughout the rest of the day. But where we landed at the end in terms of recommendations was build healthy and resilient coastal communities and protect critical place-based infrastructure. And I think one of the values of the field trips that we've been doing all over the state is just seeing how local so much of this is, and how there isn't a one-size-fits-all for Machias and Rockland and Old Orchard Beach and I miss Rumford, but there is no such thing. Anything that might seem like a solution, Kathleen would probably laugh at if we came down and said, you should do this, because we need to really incorporate local recommendations into everything we're doing. So important. Support climate adaptation of Maine's fisheries, aquaculture, and seafood industries. I mean, we are seeing change in action. If you ask any fisherman what the only constant is, whether you're talking about climate change or anything else, the one constant we see out on the water all the time is change. No 2 years are ever similar. So when you talk about change, there isn't really much more of an industry that's familiar with that and can adapt than the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry. So we're used to change, but not necessarily change of this magnitude and on this time table. And then third, monitor, conserve, and increase resilience, coastal and marine ecosystems. I think when we started out, both Carl and I had this as our top priority, or our top recommendation was monitoring. We can talk till we're blue in the face about what we think and what models say might happen, but unless we have on the ground monitoring of what's happening in real time, a lot of those decisions could be arbitrary. DMR does such an amazing job of putting together time series on different species year in and year out. So we can track that and see that through time and make decisions based on that. But given the scale of the potential impacts of climate change, monitoring of everything from just straight water temperature out in the Gulf of Maine at different depths, Syracuse and their buoy system does such an amazing job of that. But if you go on there today, so many of those buoys at so many different depths are down. That's information that we need on a daily basis. Because right now, if you look at The western Gulf of Maine buoy at 60 meters, it hasn't been working for 3 days. I know that's pathetic. That's the first thing I look at every time I wake up in the morning is what temperatures are doing. But on July 28th, it was 43 degrees. The coldest it's been in 20 some odd years in the Gulf of Maine at 60 feet in the western part of the state was on July 28th. 50 degrees in the eastern part of the state. Is that because we're seeing more cold, fresh slope water come in from climate change impacts further north? That's the type of information we need through monitoring, but obviously our priorities changed, and it's still one of our top priorities, given the storms and everything we're talking about today. I said I'd be brief, I'm failing miserably at that. I apologize. So empower local and regional community climate adaptation and resilience efforts. And some of these you can see right here. I won't go through them all, but this is really, really important stuff. It just highlights the importance of local. You look at the coast of Maine, and that spans more coastline mileage-wise with all the islands and peninsulas than California. What works in Castle Bay doesn't work in Cutler. And I'll tell you next week if it works at Matinicus. If it looks like I'm staring at you guys, I apologize. We booked 3 days out on Matinicus next week for my wife, 2 kids, and 2 dogs. So I'm very excited to get out there. I've never been out there before, but I'll report back on some of the impacts out there. Let's see. And then increased resilience of public and private working waterfront infrastructure to climate change. Commissioner Kelleher showed that picture of Canada. And right after the storms, I had a meeting up in Moncton. And as we were driving back, I did a similar tour. And you stop at any of those harbors, and it looks like they had mobilized every single harbor for the Germans back in World War II. Like that infrastructure is legit. And I think we need to start thinking about that as a state. It's a very different strategy from a community perspective, but I would argue what we are fighting is more persistent and long-term impacts than anything we've had to mobilize through history in any of our harbors. And we need to think of it at that scale. And obviously, as we've heard in all of our field trips, funding is the challenge. And how do we overcome a lot of that is a question we need to think long and hard about. And lastly, preserve and expand waterfront access. We've heard about that so much through the presentations today. You could say it till we're blue in the face, but given economic pressures, it's really, really challenging when you lose one boat ramp at a time, one wharf at a time. The cumulative impact of all of those losses to communities up and down the coast is real, and it's happening. And you have to overcome a lot of money and a lot of lawyers to preserve this, and that's a challenge for people who may not have either of those things. So, like I said, we have better experts in the room here who can answer more questions moving forward. So I will leave it at that, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak here today.
You guys want to? Yeah.
I try.
And I will say, Kurt did a good job, but we have, his 3 slides there is a many-page report that I think our team will be thinking about, how do we mine those recommendations, those details for this.
No question.
Awesome, cool. Those of you who missed earlier introductions, Nick Batista, Chief Policy Officer here at the Island Institute. I'm here today for the Working Waterfront Coalition. Island Institute's currently providing capacity to help coordinate and support the coalition as a whole. Just a quick bit of background, I've been around working waterfront conversations in Maine for about 15 years, and also for the last 7 pretty deep into Maine's efforts to expand rural broadband access. Hard to have a meeting with Hannah without talking about broadband, which is also place-based infrastructure and a lot of similar capacity challenges. So last fall, the Working Waterfront Coalition articulated some needs that are facing the state today, as well as some of the changes that have been happening in the state. And a lot of that work ended up as being foundational inputs into GoPIF's recent successful grant for NOAA and the Coastal Marine Working Group recommendations that Kurt was just talking about. And so this is really all to say that the work that is just been talked about, that Pat here just talked about as well, there's been a group of folks working to develop that and understand that these are needs and pressures facing our coastal communities. And so I'm trying to represent the sector here, not the Island Institute, but it might be tricky a little bit. So a little bit of background, Island Institute and Maine Sea Grant are two of the founding organizations of the Working Waterfront Coalition, along with Coastal Enterprises, CEI, the Maine Coastal Programs, NLA, DMR, a few others. Approximately 20 years ago, Working Waterfront Coalition is a network of organizations, trade associations, community partners, working waterfront owners, those who depend on working waterfronts for their business. Originally, the coalition formed around changing land use pressures on working waterfronts and a fear of a loss of access. The Land for Maine's Future Working Waterfront Access Protection Program comes directly out of that. Today, the challenges facing the coast are a little bit different. Pat talked a little bit about some of the demographic challenges. And that was one of the big ones that the Working Waterfront Coalition identified last fall, was that there's a set of pressures on the land side. There's things happening in these coastal communities that are putting pressure on the land side of working waterfronts. And there are things happening in the Gulf of Maine, whether it's fisheries regulation or shifting species, that are putting pressure on the water side businesses that support working waterfronts. They're caught in the middle. This slide is a set of information the coalition shared with the Climate Council as we're kicking off the Working Waterfront or the Coastal Marine Working Group process. We can go to the next one, and then just a couple of thoughts around the conversation around climate ready infrastructure had already started. Working waterfronts are a critical place that support other people and other businesses in adapting to climate change as well, which is something that we saw in the January storms. The working waterfront business owner and the fishermen or aquaculturists who rely on them aren't always the same people. And so you have this private infrastructure providing a public good or a place for other businesses to operate. We'll leave that there. Mission of the Working Waterfront Coalition. Working Waterfront Coalition is a statewide collaboration of public and private marine sector partners dedicated to supporting and enhancing Maine's working waterfront through policy communication, outreach, data, and pursuing funding opportunities. Members are asked to sign on to a set of guiding values to participate in the coalition. And really, it's a recognition that these are big challenges, and as a coalition, we can't tackle them individually, we have to tackle them together. We do that through sharing information, resources, things that are happening. And then we also are working on projects and provide the space for coordination across various projects. Members are currently working on data collection and inventories, model oriented zoning, working waterfront property acquisition, and ownership models, and then coming together to support efforts like the GoPIF grant. So I think a couple of just quick things to note. When it comes to the storm impacts, there were the working waterfronts that were damaged by the storms. There's a whole bunch of other working waterfronts in the state that weren't damaged by those storms, whether it's because they made some resilience upgrades or they just happened to be facing a different way in their harbor, and the next storm could get them very easily. And so it's thinking about folks who are damaged and helping them rebuild. But what about this other class of working waterfronts? I think the coalition and in the Climate Council conversations as well, there was a real emphasis on taking a comprehensive approach to resilience of working waterfronts and coastal communities. And so not doing it piecemeal, one here, one there, but really starting to look at it as a statewide challenge. There's some shared, I think there's some opportunities in doing that. And then it's just, it's such a big coast and such a big conversation that if we spend all our time chasing, one working waterfront project here, we miss the bigger picture, which is there are so many harbors along the coast that all have working waterfronts that are important to those harbors. The coalition stands ready to support GoPIF in implementing the grant and helping move that forward. For this commission, we have limited baseline information about the number of working waterfronts across the coast or their key attributes. Collecting that information on a statewide scale is a challenge. It's been alluded to before. I think the GoPIF grant will help with that, but it's really important. We're flying blind and we don't have the information that we collectively need as a sector to start to have these conversations, particularly as we're talking about a need of, $100 million or more for infrastructure. Most of the work that's been happening in the Working Waterfront Coalition has been happening off of the side of people's desks. There are very few people in the state who are funded to actually work on working waterfronts. For the most part, it's somebody funded to work on something else, and then working waterfronts get slipped in as a related or supportive activity or a synergistic activity. And so having the capacity in state government, in local government, in the nonprofit sector, in the business sector, to engage in these conversations is really important. And that capacity, for a couple times today, Julie mentioned it, that capacity is really important for somebody like her. If you don't have a Julie, that capacity is even more important. The capacity is helpful for the state to run grant programs, for engaging with communities, engaging with partners. And I think this sector in particular is pretty capacity limited. I think the last two things, so the Coastal Marine Working Group identified this need is at a scale of about $100 million for resilience. I think it's worth saying to this commission, that group was a group of policy people, fisheries management experts, community development folks. We're not a collective group of people who build infrastructure or fully have a sense of what that costs. And so I think there's more work to be done there. I don't think that's a low estimate on the number. As big as the group could wrap their head around saying, it might be a little bit bigger or a lot bigger. And then the working waterfronts in particular, I think are susceptible to abrupt changes. And so whether it's a storm that washes out a working waterfront and then it disappears, or it's a change in the ecosystem that impacts the businesses that support a working waterfront, working waterfronts can disappear either very quickly and abruptly, or it could be a slow, gradual change as the business changes. What we saw in the January storms, I think, was a heightened risk of that abrupt change, and that can have very significant consequences for the character and the feel of our coastal communities and for our state as a whole. So turn it over to Gail in just a second here, but capacity support is wicked helpful, absolutely critical. We need more of it. And then funding to undertake the work, once we know what that is also really important. And then funding for the work of building the sector, understanding the sector, the data, the inventories, all of the collateral material you need to make a push for big infrastructure funding. And then we need that big infrastructure funding. Pat talked a little bit about the public policy challenge of these are in Maine a lot of times private businesses. And so when public money goes to private businesses, we have to be pretty careful. And that gets to be an interesting policy challenge. I'm glad we've at least crossed that bridge that it's possible for the state to do, and the state is willing to do that in the wake of the January storms. But it's, I think, going to remain a challenge for this commission to balance. What do we get for resilience? What do we get for long-term protection or securing protection over time for what we spend in public funds? So, yeah, we got some good stuff too to talk about.
Thanks, Nick. Introduction again, Gail Zidleski, Maine Sea Grant, I'm the director. And I want to say a few things to the history of the Working Waterfront Coalition and really jump forward to what hopefully where the direction we'll be taking. So again, focusing on the coalition, we have two staff members, Natalie Springle, who you may have met last time in Machias. She's been working with the Working Waterfront Coalition since I think the beginning, about 20 years ago or so. And Kristen Grant, who was mentioned this morning, has been working in this space for a long time. She's based at Wells Reserve and also a Maine Sea Grant extension agent. And the two of them, their longevity is gold to build on in the community work that they've been doing. And I'll just also say that out of that came the National Working Waterfront Network. So if you're not familiar, there's a larger network across the entire nation that is really built from the work in Maine. So it's really exciting because we're attached to that network. And when the storms hit this past year, everybody was in, what can we do? How can we help? What can we do? How can we help? So the Sea Grant program, we reached out to our folks in the Gulf of Mexico and the South to say, what is the most valuable thing we could be doing right now? And what we heard loud and clear is, let's sit back and find out what people need, but take the time and then listen and listen and listen and figure out what the needs really are. And so one of the things that we did was, and really leaned on with the coalition, is reach out to the NOAA Sea Grant office and said, we really need to do this work in community with people as they're responding and thinking about the working waterfront storms that are happening. So we did receive a bit of funding, and you may have heard about this, but to do some convenings across the coast this coming fall. Those are gearing up right now, thanks to the coalition work and bringing people together to think about what those should look like. And it's about bringing people together to create a space for community members in those communities where things weren't affected or they were affected in certain ways, so that we could hear what worked, what didn't work, what is moving forward in these different places. And so I just wanted to bring that to you. Those haven't kicked off. We're still in the planning stages. The coalition is key to pulling together where should those happen, what should happen at those convenings, and as those kind of gear up, which should be happening actually in September, October timeframe. We'll be doing those listening sessions. There's so much need as we've all been listening and thinking about all of the different communities that you could go and do this with. We're trying to think of it from a regional perspective. We said 10. Right now, the last list I saw, there's 17, and please help us. How do we figure out how to do 10, how to do 17 regional areas anyway? So that's moving forward. And then thanks to the new GoPIF NOAA funding, there'll be some, and we're doing that a lot in coordination. Also, the coastal program has been key to that work. And the new NOAA funding will support 2 new positions at Maine Sea Grant. One is going to have an coastal hazards engineering focus, and one is going to be completely working waterfront focus. So this is Natalie and Kristen is exactly what Nick said. It's like a thing on their plate that doesn't always get as much attention as we want it to. And now we'll have a person who's dedicated. And this is where we look to you, like one new person. How does the commission think that person might spend their time when we're starting to think about these big working waterfront issues? So again, we'll bring back what we learned to you, but we hope to hear from you as well on how we can shape what moves forward with the coalition.
Thanks, Gail. Any specific questions for Gail? Okay, and Nick, thank you as well. We'd like to kind of open the panel to, I'm going to try to keep us on time. We're running a little bit late, but that's fine. But we'd like to do some reflection on what we've heard from the speakers today. We're going to invite the panelists to share their perspective and ideas about the commission, the direction. So we're going to hear from some of our commissioners who would like to reflect on what we've heard. Linda, co-chair, is going to offer her perspective on municipal challenges and solutions, including both learning from Rockland and Stonington experiences. Jack, who is the chairman and CEO of Read and Read and a commissioner. We're going to hear on his reflections. There's been a lot about infrastructure. Spends his, and the need for the money. He's the guy that spends the money. So, and very efficiently too. And then Pat Kelleher on your Nick Batista, working Waterfront Coalition, and Ken Knauer, a marine engineer with Proctor Marine, on what you're hearing. Certainly, Ken, I've heard from many of my friends up and down the coast that sort of, they're ready to go, but how do you find somebody to do the work? And certainly often all eyes turn to Proc Marine at Central. So, and you know, I'd like to start with Jack and Ken, you know, to sort of ask, what does the storm recovery look like for your companies? Do you have the construction and engineering capacity to meet the current rebuilding needs? Do engineers have solutions to rebuild the working waterfront infrastructure to be more resilient and perhaps in a more expedient way than has been done? But people have had, you know, years sometimes to plan a project, not in response of a devastating event. And then Pat and Nick, how do you get a better sense, how do we get a better sense of where the working waterfront is most at risk? Is there a way to sort of prioritize things? It seems like this is such a massive problem, but you know, I'm afraid to say it's like, you know, the old adage of how do you eat a whale or whatever, it's one bite at a time. We have to really figure out, what's priority, what isn't? How do you get people to understand that when they look to us, the government, whether it's state or federal, to by and large provide most of the funding for projects? And Linda, from your perspective in Stonington, based on what we've learned in our conversations with coastal communities, what's most important for the commission to keep in mind as we explore ways to ensure working waterfronts remain viable and accessible into the future? I'm going to moderate the conversation and take off from there. So we'll start. What did I say? We're going to start with Pat and Nick.
Jack and Ken.
Or Jack and Ken. Oh, that's right. We're going to start with Jack and Ken.
You guys can fight amongst yourselves.
Who talks first?
All kinds of notes there. Try to collect my thoughts as Dan was speaking. So the first part of your question was how it affected our company. Well, mostly our exposure was on rivers and on the Androscoggin and Kennebec, not coastal areas. You know, the risk was high, but we managed to get through it okay on some bridge projects that we're doing. The process, when I think about these projects, I think about prioritizing public versus the private sector. I think about how do we look at these projects from a business standpoint? We're in the business of running a profitable operation for our employees. We're employee owned, 100% employee owned. And so I look at what are the things that prevent us from being successful on projects on the waterfront. And the first thing that comes to mind is permits. It's permits. It's delays because of marine life requirements, restrictions. It's that's the primary thing. So there are, Joyce can tell you, there were work windows when you're working on the river and in the ocean and in the harbors. And so when we kind of probably agree with this, when you pull up with barges and cranes and people and tugboats and you're ready to go to work, and you can only work certain months of the year, it's incredibly uneconomical. And from a business standpoint, we say, why do we do this? It doesn't make sense. So we need to think about that as we go forward about revisions to permitting requirements where possible. Second thing is, and I heard today down on the waterfront, and it's reality, which is that on the waterfront, the people who use it like to have it available during certain months of the year. That's great. But what do we do with our barges and cranes and our people? Where do we put them? You can't just sail them away, park them somewhere, and pay the folks and hope that they can come back to work in October, because it just doesn't work from a business model standpoint. For our company, we're just getting started on a big marine project for the Maine Maritime Academy down in Cassidy. We're building a new dock for their new ship. It's an $80-some-odd million project. And I mentioned that simply because a lot of the projects we've seen talked about here are very small by that standard. And it's hard for us to gear down for some of those projects. I think you have some great local contractors up and down the coast who are really talented. But one of the things that I think the permit process, again, going back to that, is it's geared towards technical expertise and engineering requirements that a lot of small owners and a lot of small contractors can't deal with effectively. They can't. They just throw up their hands. And what I saw some of the pictures was, within a day or two, they had excavators on barges. They cleaned up the mess. That's ingenuity. That's what I love to see along the Maine coast. But we tie people up in red tape, and permit requirements, and restrictions, and limitations to the point where you don't unlock that ingenuity and that ability along the waterfront, which is an opportunity for us going forward. Solutions, okay, permit by rule. I think everybody sort of has a sense of that. It's a great approach to things. I was telling Dan as we walked over here that we were building wind projects up in the mountains a few years ago. We established a toolbox for when we encountered certain types of conditions, whether it's a drainage condition or a stream or whatever. We would look at our toolbox of approved solutions to that, and they're pre-approved. So we didn't have to apply for a permit change. Just the one out that made the most sense. We did it. So I think those kinds of things can be very helpful. We have finite resources as a company, finite the people, equipment, management skill, resources. So we're going to apply them as a business where it makes the most amount of sense for us. And to the extent that some of these restrictions can be revised in a way that's more business friendly, I think that would be great. Last point I would say is just a detail point. So the new pier that we're going to build for the new ship at Maine Maritime Academy is 4.5 feet higher than the existing pier. 4.5 feet. That's sort of the dimension thinking of how to deal with rising limits of so that's pretty much all I had. But throw it over to Ken. Go ahead, Ken.
All right. We did have a little bit of struggles during the storms. We had a granite wall wash out twice. We had probably 2 or 3 feet of water in our yard. So we're chasing stuff around, it's floating around, tying stuff down. We lost access to it, but we pulled all our floats, put our little wharf access, we lost that. So but it was minor compared to what we saw everybody else go through. We did spend probably 2 weeks cleaning up other wharfs, chasing people's docks down, floats. Most of them were existing customers, docks we built just a year ago that were, to the code or whatever. A lot of money there, just cleaning up, trying to help people get back on their feet. What was the next question? Oh, you don't really have, I don't see a lot of capacity for all this increased funding. We kind of have a finite amount of people, finite amount of barges. It seems to be reducing all the time. I know other small contractors seem to be going out of business, getting out of the business. It's just that, it's that little area where the project's only, it sounds like a lot of money to the homeowner. You charge them $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for a dock, but for companies like Reed, these guys that do the bridges are looking for $5-6 million job. It's just not worth their time. It's not worth the headache. A lot of it's not worth dealing with the owner, changing their mind, one type of handrail, different type of handrail. It's a lot, it's a lot of work for a couple $100,000 as opposed to $5 or $6 million. In the engineering, it's the same with the engineering side. We see there seems to be less engineers that know on both the marine structures. There are a lot of more older guys getting out. Still the firms around, but the guys that always did the work or knew
what was going on, seemed to have retired. So it's tough to get a real economical design on some of the bigger jobs. Everything is belt and suspenders. And nobody pushes back on the permits because they're not familiar with it and they don't know any better. And it's not just DEP. You know, towns have their own challenges. They all have their own little, they want to change they want to limit the length of the ramp, or they want to limit the size of the float, or, limit the height of the dock. All those things really come into play when you're trying to make a resilient structure. I feel sound very pessimistic. I would love to.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah.
I listen to you two all the time.
In the future, what I see is, a lot of places you're constrained by what you're tying into one land. You can't change the height of the state. So you're limited to the access, what's going out to the wharf or the pier. If it's too low, I think you're gonna make the structure less resilient. You're gonna make, your deck needs to be able to break away. You need put your structure up on piles so the water will go under it or through it. And for example, Journey's End, they have their heated storage building built out on an old granite wharf. They put a ton of concrete in it. That was fine. But they put a concrete walkway all the way around, where they walk a crane out there to, put their floats in and out, or to have access to do boat maintenance and that kind of stuff. Sea came in, hit that granite key wall, and blew those concrete slabs right off the apartments, pulled the pins out, totally destroyed the place. That looked pretty resilient when it was built, but it didn't stand a chance with that wave action. So now we're looking at redesigning, putting doors in. Still has to be rugged enough to drive on, put a crane on, but you got to be able to pull panels up for the winter, or let them hinge, something like that. We've talked about even doing open grading or something, So that's, but mainly it's height. You gotta go up. Camden let us go up a couple feet. Of course, people are trying to go another 2 feet. Could be places that are exposed. You got to be up at elevation 20 to survive now.
Explain to everybody what elevation 20 is.
It's depending on the tide. You're looking at 10 feet above high water. Because a lot of our structures, a lot of our private piers, the beams are 2 feet in depth. So that puts the bottom of your beam at elevation 18, which is only 8 feet above high water, and you got to tie that down, because I think we had structures at 20 that didn't get ruined, but they got moved around a little bit.
Yeah, I've an actual question, if you could just opine on, because it's something that's I've wondered about, and that is what the barrier to entry is for the kind of business you say is needed to be able to respond to this kind of stuff. Obviously, there are not going to be many $80 million resiliency jobs in the kind of communities we were talking about, and there are the private clients, there are the smaller jobs, which you do, and disclosure, you've done a lot of projects for me, but having been in the construction business all my life, I know that you're going to go where the clients are likely to pay you, and it's going to be relatively quick, and they have great consultants, and you always have X number of more projects that you could take than you're going to take, so you choose the ones that you think are best. But it seems to me right now, and for the last number of years, these storm events that have happened this year are unique, but the backlog industry has had for as long as I can remember is just, remarkable. It seems to me there's a huge opportunity around working waterfronts to develop a more robust kind of local community. And our local player, one of the people you were probably talking about, went out of business. He just doesn't do any more, so the town of Port Clyde or Friendship or all that kind of, until you bring a barge down, nobody's doing any work. Well, maybe not for this conversation, but what would you, being in the contracting business, how could we develop perhaps a program to encourage more people to get in the industry? Is there state financing? Is it a licensing issue? Is it that prospective contractors are just afraid of the whole permitting thing and knowing that they're gonna have, if you're a contractor, you've got to understand permitting, and if you've never done it, you're worried that you'll do it wrong and you'll lose money. Or is it that there hasn't been enough technical training? I mean, I don't know whether University of Maine, they have engineering schools, but whether Maine Maritime, whether Mid-Coast School of Technology offer marine engineering or contracting, how do you get people interested in this work to be able to take on what looks to be a pretty endless amount of work that could happen in the future?
Great question. Help is tough. I mean, especially, a lot of times we'll have guys go out to a job site and not come back until the job's done, just because they're going to Monhegan or even just up to Vinyl Haven or wandering on to that. So they'll stay on the tugboat. There's not many guys going to get that want to go away from home and stay on a tugboat with a bunch of guys, for a week or two. And, in general, we try to get hotel rooms, we try to get places for them to stay, but most of the time, the guys we have just prefer to stay there, get the job done, and get home, as opposed to driving 2 hours every night, just to get to a hotel room or an hour. But the entry cost to get into the business is huge. I'm guessing Bancroft just sunk $6 million, and I don't think they have any work at all. See what happens. I mean, you gotta have property on the water, and you have to then should probably be a couple $1 million. Barge is over $1 million. Cut's going to be over $1 million. And you have to keep the certifications up. Inspections, you got the subchapter M, so you got to do with the Coast Guard. It's a tough business. It's not like Joe Sixpack with a dump truck and an excavator can bang out all kinds of work, have no worries at all. It's hard to string together a lot of small jobs to make that work economically. It's really hard. The only, one thought I would have, and I've talked to Joyce about this with bridge work, is bundling. Take a group of maybe public waterfront infrastructure projects that are maybe in the same geographic area, maybe similar construction methods, and bundle them into a master contract. So maybe it's $10 million worth of work in 4 locations or something like that. That gets to be a little more attractive. Kevin's absolutely right about the workforce challenges that we have in the state. Anybody who's in business knows what the issue is. It's everywhere. Politics, but a lot of things we do in Augusta, they get even more difficult to stay in business. Lots of things. Yeah, you just scratch our heads sometimes.
The work window thing, you do have a few people here who I've talked to about the work window issue. And I do believe, and I would say this, that I think Maine has some of the most stringent in-work requirements of any state on the eastern seaboard. And I mean, any state on the eastern seaboard, other than Washington State and Oregon, we're like third. They cannot get in the water because of different, federal and some state requirements. I always say DEP is the least of my problems. I mean, it's worse. Yes, you are.
Wait, can you say that?
But this work window thing is a real barrier in terms of we lose over half our season they cannot be in the water. And so from an economic point of view, I think that's something that we really have to understand that, and we're not even just talking about endangered species we're trying to protect. So it's a real issue here and it adds to your cost. So see, I have you back on this, but I think it's a very real thing.
It is, so we're building a bridge over the Androscoggin River, big project at Thompson. We have $3 million worth of cranes that sat there from March 15th until Friday, couldn't work in the river. And as if that isn't unbelievable enough, the work went opens August 1st on the Thompson side, but September 1st on the Brunswick side, same river. And we, as a contractor, I just scratch my head and say, I don't get it. And so as we encounter these things again and again and again, just say, why do we do this?
Well, I'm gonna move us along, but this is a fascinating conversation. I know we spent a lot of, but at the end of the day, if we can't figure out how to get the stuff done, we can raise all the money in the world and have all the plans, but getting it in place is such an important piece of this equation. It's clear we don't have the infrastructure to do that. I mean, I think what I've seen is that a lot of people that really don't know what to do, they go ahead and do it anyway, and I think that's probably not the best use of the money because it's likely not going to last.
Can I ask an ignorant question? It's very quick, and I'm not expecting a drawn-out discussion. I just want a quick yes, no, short answer. Sort of. Is it possible to have legislation that will specify, restrict the amount of time a town or the office can take to kind of give out permits? Is that possible?
Sure, yeah. No,
To say that it cannot be beyond 15 days or 30 days, is that possible?
Yep, so again, Rob Wood with the Department of Environmental Protection. So there are statutes that have been in place in most cases for 20, 30 years at this point that govern permit application processing times. In some cases, for certain laws, those are set in statute, like a stormwater permit application needs to be processed in 90 days. Other processing times are set annually by the commissioner, by the department. So we, in many cases, don't change processing timelines year to year. But if there are significant changes in workload or resources, one way or the other, we might change processing timelines for certain application types. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single application gets processed within that processing timeline, because we do have staffing constraints, very significant staffing constraints, and then we do have significant changes in application volume over time. So I'm just looking at our weekly report. I get a report every Monday that shows how many license applications we have in the door, and this is just for state environmental permits, right? Not local permits, which is a separate issue with federal permits, which I believe is the driver of the issue with the work window on the Androscoggin is the federal agencies, not the DEP. And we have 670 applications in the door today that we're processing. Back in January, before the storms, it was 450, and our staffing hasn't changed at all in that time. And so we're feeling a lot of pressure. We're scrambling, trying to get permits out the door, but it's just a crush of workload. So that's the kind of major barrier we're facing.
Let's move on. That's a good question, and I think there's a big topic around permits that we're going to grapple with. And there are permits at every level, especially with this kind of marine work. So Pat and Nick, how do we get a better sense of where working waterfronts are at risk? And with respect to data and mapping, do we have an updated figure on the miles of working waterfront that are in the state?
So the short answer is no, we don't have an updated figure. What we have is a report from 2007 that the Island Institute did. And that report identified a couple of key attributes for working waterfront: deep water access, gas availability, ice availability, some of the attributes in that report may be less important today, and we may want to know about other things. How high are you? What service, what other kinds of services do you provide? Do you have a hoist for loading or unloading cargo? To re-survey the coast would be a moderately significant undertaking to establish that kind of a baseline again. There's a bunch of work that's been happening at the municipal level. So there's Maine Coast Fishermen Association and a few other members of the Working Waterfront Coalition have been supporting municipalities in doing very detailed inventories at the community level of their working waterfronts. And that's both the physical infrastructure and also the paths that people take down to the shoreline, to the clam flats, or to go worming. And that also is counting as working waterfront infrastructure in the coalition at the state. And it's really important in some communities. I think the short answer is we don't have the data and the information that we need to have this conversation. That's part of why one of the recommendations in the Coastal Marine Working Group is a statewide working waterfront strategy. And I think that's why the GoFIF grant prioritized or included a whole bunch of support for inventories, data collection, this kind of analysis. There's another set of economic analysis that would go along with some of this too. It's about to know where the access points are, what people are doing there, what kinds of fishing activities happening off of there or it's supporting is really helpful. We know that there's working waterfronts that are important because they're buying stations or they're loading or unloading stations. We know there are working waterfronts that are important more intermittently because that's where people change out their gear. That's where people do something, with their boats every couple of weeks instead of daily. Without that other infrastructure, their businesses couldn't function in serving a different purpose. And then there's all the boat yards and everything else that supports our marine industry. So I think the short answer is no. The longer answer is that's a really rich area to be working in. And I think for this commission, it's really helpful to be thinking about what are the end goals? Is it resilience of the state, of the coast? Is it at the community scale? The Island Institute, we work a lot with very small communities, so we get a little nervous when it's like a 20 fisherman threshold because some of the communities we work with don't have 20 fishermen, but every person in that community, every family in that community has a connection to the fishing industry. And so we like to think about dependency on the fishery. Are there other alternatives for people to do in that community? Stonington is an example of a community that's highly dependent on the fishery. Frenchboro, Swans Island, Final Haven, all communities that are very, very dependent on the fishery without a ton of other economic opportunities. That probably makes them more vulnerable to changes in the working waterfront infrastructure, either the availability of it or its resilience. So.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, we need more information, and I think that's why my slide, I put that focus area, right? We need to focus on what this is and what the data is that we need. One of the other hats I wear is the chair of the Land for Maine Future Board, and what we see through that process all the time are land trusts, coastal land trusts, coming to us with projects that actually deal with those access points for clamming, for warming, for those other things. Right? I don't think that should be our focus. I think harbors where access to boats, access to deep water is really a critical component. And I think Nick is right. It's, everything we talked about 20 years ago is kind of off the table now. So now it's focusing on areas within our harbors, within our coastal communities, where we need to have resiliency. And I think it's beyond just trying to inventory everything. I think we need to focus on inventorying those highest priority areas. And that's not in place right now. Everything that we do is being opportunistic to what comes forward. And in this last grant round, just ran, it's no different. I'm still stuck on permitting, because I agree, we need to resolve that. And that's coming from a resource manager who doesn't think you need to have these extensive work with us. So
Just quickly while we're here, I mean, this is just fascinating here, and I bring this up, I think, at every meeting, but since December of 2021, and maybe even before that, but the majority of these storms, damaging storms we've seen have come in from the southeast. Normally winter storms are coming from the north. If you look at the coast here, you can see the wind direction coming from the northeast versus the southeast, and you can see where different areas are exposed to those storms, which we're probably going to see more and more of. You can see why Harpswell got walloped, why New Harbor had roofs floating in the harbor in the commissioner's picture, Old Orchard Beach, all the places we visited. This is a really great opportunity to visualize those areas that are going to be exposed going forward if and when we continue to see storms, especially in the winter coming in the southeast.
Yeah, one of the things I think is, I'm hoping that can come out of this, Nick, and it's something you said, is a, kind of a map that actually demonstrates what resilience means. So not only, because when I think of resilience, we're talking, we get caught in thinking about, okay, these working waterfront access points, but, in our town, they got destroyed, but the road leading to them got destroyed too. So that's part of, you got to fix the road, otherwise you're not investing the right amount of money. And the power. We heard this morning that, power in Rockland, a lot of it was not waterproof and underwater. And, so what good's a working waterfront? So really to layer on, find a way to gather the data where we can layer on all of the issues. So we're not piecemealing it.
I would add to that, I think working waterfront infrastructure is particularly unique in this world because it is meant to be on the water. It's meant to be at that interface with the ocean. And so it might be worth thinking about what kinds of infrastructure can get wet. Does it matter if it gets wet? Stonington Fish Pier was well underwater in some of these storms, wasn't damaged in the same way as some of the other piers in Stonington. So if things are designed to get wet, that may help us get through some of these challenges.
I would say that the Stonington example you just made is probably one of the best arguments for modernization of infrastructure on the coast of Maine. That was a fairly newer, attended to facility. And I think that paid dividends when you look at the impact from the January storms comparatively to similarly sited older infrastructure in the exact same community. And weigh those impacts, it's pretty striking. So some of the things that Ken was speaking about as well, in how to look at resiliency when you have some difficulties in the interplay and the transition into the upland areas. If you have a low level ledge, road, and you have to raise your pier up, then you're looking at a much more complex project. So it's very difficult to have a one size fits all for marine infrastructure in general, but working waterfront especially. And I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring on the work windows. One aspect of work windows that I don't think was touched upon is the fact that it can be a major cost driver in a larger project, because it can, instead of be a single construction season project, be a multiple construction season project if there's enough in-water work. And it is a cost driver, can affect mobilization and demobilization costs. And then you're asking these folks to work in the middle of the winter on the ocean. And we all know that's challenging on a good day.
And I suggest that we take a 10-minute break here and then come back and kick off the.
Should we let's have Linda, I just want to bring in Linda.
Let's have Linda, and then I think maybe people, if they need to take a break, should just take a break. I don't think, we have it, if we take a break for everybody, we have just an hour left, and then, so we'll need to be used to, unless, is that all right? Okay, so Linda, you're gonna, what you're gonna talk about.
Well, thank you. And a lot of the things that I've talked about have been well raised by other people in the room today and by Julie, in terms of her speaking about Rockland earlier. But I want to thank Nick just now for his kind of summary about working waterfront being place-based infrastructure. And I think when we think about place-based infrastructure, we have to think about place. And when we think about place, we have to think about communities, which means we have to think about people. So when I listen to you guys, Proc and Reed, and both of whom are in Stonington, both of whom are doing jobs with us, which we're very, very grateful for. But yeah, why do we not have more people going into those things so that we don't have the long wait times, right? So we can't really be resilient or recover from these events if the labor isn't there. So I know that we're talking about infrastructure and we're supposed to be talking about those hard material things, but I think that there's some soft issues around the infrastructure that we as a commission are going to really have to deal with. And one of those is the changing demographic, as Pat mentioned. Part of the labor issues that we've got an aging demographic. We certainly have that in Stonington. If we didn't have Buster, who's in his 80s, geez, he does what Proc does, right? He's got his barge. He's in his 80s, okay? We're going to lose Buster. We're going to lose that access. Our guys are out there. Our fishermen are making some of their transitions. They're buying the excavators. They're buying the pickup trucks, but they're not buying the barges or the tugboats. And so how do we work together? How do we create incentives to move towards some of these things? We really do. I think we need to really think about that kind of policy because, supporting our working waterfront, it's about supporting our year-round economies, our coastal economies, but it's also about supporting our culture and our heritage. And we have an awful lot to lose here right now. We know in Stonington, I think Pat said it, I think, Kurt said it, it's changing faster than anybody ever thought. The climate is changing faster, but the money is changing faster. So here's what we need from the commission down in Stonington. We need speed. So when properties come on the market, we're not going to be able to protect all the properties. When properties come on the market, we as a municipality need the speed to be able to respond to that. And the funding sources, the public funding sources that are out there don't give us that. So, as Deborah and some of our other colleagues know, we've been working really hard to create different kinds of funding mechanisms that give us speed of response for properties, because that flexible funding, right? So the flexibility to use the funding for what the priorities are, because these storms are somewhat predicted, but they're predicted days in advance, right? They're not predicted like years in advance. We knew climate change was coming. And you guys have heard me say this before. Our sea level rise study dates back to 2017. Our modification report, our adaptation report is from 2019. But we couldn't get any funding to do any of those things until 2023, 2022, and then we got hit. Right, before any of those adaptations were in place. So even for a town like Stonington, which we're lucky to have the visionary leadership of Kathleen, who keeps getting cited here, she's very much about get the plans done, get the permitting done, have the bid packages done so that you can receive the money, right? And that's what we need to do as small communities. That's what we've really worked on. But even we as a town who worked on that, we're behind, right? And the other reason that we're behind and that I think this commission can help with is that because the funding has not been there for so many years, deferred maintenance is killing us. It's killing our communities, it's killing our roads, it's killing everything, right? So we have a lot of deferred maintenance out there that we're catching up on. How do we incentivize and how do we put stuff in place to stop the deferred maintenance and to get stuff up to speed and then to continue to keep it up to speed? It's really hard because the funding streams, we all know, they're up and down with the political winds, right? And that's part of the problem. So we've come through a period like 20 years when that money wasn't there and the deferred maintenance has been one of the big issues that we are all facing. So how we stop deferring our maintenance. I think the electrification of the marine infrastructure is a really, really super interesting problem because we are right on the water, right on the salt water. So yeah, our pier survived. It was a great example, thanks to ship grants that we've gotten, and we've got a funding request in now to dredge, so that's not deferring maintenance, right, to keep that pier current and up to speed, but still it has electrics on it, right? And If we're gonna work on climate resilience, we want it to have even more electrics on it. But making electrification at the edge of the salt water resilient is challenging. It's really super challenging. We need to think about that part of it because sometimes we're asking for things that aren't like feasible, right? And in Stonington, like we're at the end of a long, bad electrical cable on one feed. So we can't even rely on that feed. Okay, it's line number 10. I can tell you exactly what it is and where it goes. So until we get that electrical system up and stable and resilient, then we can't be resilient, right? We can't, our working waterfront can't be resilient without that. So that's the other piece we really need. And I completely agree with the need for data and for advocacy, because we can't even figure out, and Julie said this today about Rockland, the way our tourism office works, it doesn't give us good, clear numbers by anything but region, which doesn't help any of us at all. And when you look at the way our tax system works, we know that our tourism dollars are not benefiting our year-round community. We're paying more for those tourist dollars than we are for our fishing dollars, okay? So we actually know that, but we don't have the data to put out there to talk to people about it and to say, look, this is why we need to balance tourism. It's not a solution. It's not a panacea for coastal communities. You know, we can't just say, oh, times are changing, fishing's going, tourism's coming in. No, 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 no. We're not on board for that. But we can't have the rest of the state on board for that. And sometimes it feels like the rest of the state is on board for that. So we have to really be able to get the data and show how those tourism numbers don't actually benefit the local municipalities in the same way that everybody thinks that they do. We know from an anecdotal perspective, we know from our budget perspective that we could use that data there. So one of the things we're doing is we are working on, and Julie talked about this a little bit, you talked about it today, Dan, about putting together kind of unique partnerships for funding that we haven't seen before, like you were talking about the trail issue. We're putting together some brownfields money, right, because it's commercial waterfront, and how do we protect it to continue it for commercial use when it's been destroyed or when it's been, you know, in bad shape. So we're putting together some partnerships through our Eastern Maine Development Corporation around some funding from those sources. But so we're doing that. We're looking for those things, but we don't have the expertise always or even the knowledge to be able to access and to put that puzzle package together that we need to be able to put together so that we can keep the guys that own our deep water port on Webb's Cove, right, which is where our barges come in and where barges from all the islands come in. Like, how do we keep that a commercial property and not let it go to the rich guy on the point who really wants it because he doesn't want to drive through it to get to his point? So that's the kind of packaging that we're looking for in order to sustain important properties like that, some of the most important properties on the down East Coast. So those things, is that enough of a long list? We'd like all those things.
Part of the long list. But Linda, you actually opened up sort of the idea of the last question I wanted to ask. Spend maybe 5 minutes, and I want to ask this of Pat, Linda, and all the commissioners. All the speakers to talk a little bit about. Have you seen sort of any solutions that are bringing in or models that are bringing in other types of players like nonprofits, philanthropy, public-private partnerships? You know, are there other examples of accelerating? We've been primarily talking about this need and kind of government's response to the need. We've been talking about municipal capacity. We've been talking about state dollars. We've been talking about leveraging federal dollars. We have not talked about sort of private industry, philanthropic. There's a lot of land trusts. There's a lot of people doing conservation easements. There's, you know, there are other models out there. Just thoughts.
Jump in and say, I think I'd look to the broadband sector and 2017, 2018, the state, through the Connect Maine Authority, had about $1 million a year to invest in rural broadband infrastructure. At that rate, it was going to take us about 120 years, 150 years to solve Maine's broadband challenges. And in part, I heard this is Heather's story because she was there for this, but the state made a decision to invest heavily in planning and support local communities in doing broadband planning. And it ended up being that where those communities had the energy and the willingness to put in the work locally, the planning dollars would flow. And then the planning dollars started flowing. There was follow-on opportunities to get infrastructure dollars, and that helped with the prioritization of communities. The infrastructure dollars went to the people, to the communities who had done the work to say, this is what's important to us, this is what we need, we've gone through the process, we've done our design and our engineering, we've formed our public-private partnerships that we need for our community, that work for our community. And this is the model that we want to go forward. And by the way, the community in most of these situations was putting dollars on the table, putting community money on the table to move their projects forward. That was a pretty significant thing for these small communities to do. The other part of that planning process that was really helpful was a corresponding investment through the Maine Community Foundation in capacity in the state to support organizations like Island Institute, Greater Portland Council of Governments, some of the other regional planning commissions and other folks in helping communities move through that planning process. And so that investment in capacity was a great place for private philanthropy to support public planning dollars, to get some state funds. I think the other part of the broadband story that's really helpful here is in 2020, 2021, there was some federal money coming out, and the state pulled together a package of projects, 6 projects around the state for $29 million and applied to the federal government and received funding for those 6 projects. The state pulled the applications together. None of these projects could have applied on their own. They didn't have the capacity. There were small communities. There were businesses, hard to ask even some of the larger businesses to say, go and do the application. The state led the application process, pulled it together, managed the money, managed the application process, and then did some awards to all of these projects. And now there's a whole bunch of folks, there's about 15,000 homes in the state that have broadband because of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, Nick, because, I know we're partnering with our land trust, both Maine Coast Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust. That's one way it's another way, it's like what Nick's saying, get philanthropic dollars in. The thing that we have to be careful of and that I didn't mention, and I do think this is something we need to think about as a commission, as a recommendation, is the scalability of our granting programs. Because so if you're an aggressive town and you're out there and you're applying for a lot of money, you're gonna reach your credit cap in terms of your ability to borrow, to provide the matching monies on these grants, or to provide the upfront money because the grants are reimbursable. Okay, so it's a situation actually and so I think that there's a role for private philanthropy there as well, because the matching funds and just the upfront, the reimbursable costs is getting to the point of, for small communities, that where we can't borrow enough to make the match, to do what we need to do to be resilient.
I think the broadband example is a good one because I was thinking about it from a scale perspective. And that maybe once you have that kind of inventory and you're looking at these projects, how to come together in packages to try to, if the money is available. So I think that scale issue is a concept that's really good one. But Heather should reach out to that.
Well, we could do those big projects that had similar traits, right? Package them together and go get money for that work. And then go to the next grouping that said, okay, these people will need this to get to the next step. So put the expertise there, package together, go get this, right? And that was helpful. I think the one thing that worked really well in broadband, or is currently working well in broadband that I don't think will transfer, is this private leverage. Because there's not a race to the finish here, right? Companies are doing the best they can already in this space. In broadband, it was, wait, we're gonna stop spending money in New York and spend it over here, or you're gonna take it, you're gonna box us out. And so we did see some of that. But I think the local, I think creating local capacity without asking local communities to do more, like giving them decision without giving them work, was one of the key things in the broadband piece. And that would, to your point, Nick, was funded a lot by philanthropy, some by the state, to really think about like, here's the inventory, here's a path. Do you like this path? If so, hop on and we'll do the work, right? And think it, because there were points in time that you need expertise, but you don't need that expertise to sit in small communities all the time. And so let that share.
Continue on the train here. Thank you so much, EBCD and everything. I'll give two quick examples, and then both might not be relevant, but they're kind of industry or private-public cooperation. So the Prime Fund was an initiative that came up a few years ago that enabled us to bring three-phase power down to, we were a recipient of one of the many awards, enabled us to bring three-phase power down to our lobster holding facility in Sorrento so that we could chill our tanks, so we could hold more lobsters right there, and it benefited others along the way. When we can find those public-private partnerships that might benefit more than just one business or one community, I think those opportunities are good to look at. Another example is through MTAF 2.0, we were able to secure about $2.25 million so that we could build our plant right there in Saco. And before we built that plant in Saco, there was nothing along that stretch of Route 1. When we built that there, they brought sewer. We worked with the city to bring sewer and all kinds of other utilities there. And now we wouldn't even recognize it driving down the way you would 5 years ago. So those types of opportunities can lead to unexpected, or I mean, maybe expected results. And if we can find ways to utilize examples like that along the coast, there might be opportunities to turn them into win-wins.
Deborah has her hand up. Oh yeah, Deborah on screen.
Oh, on screen. Go ahead, Deborah.
Hi, thanks. I really, coming from philanthropy, I really appreciate this conversation. Because, you know, we even have donors who are, of course, really interested in how they can support working waterfronts and keeping the waterfronts, you know, for public purpose. And it's really challenging, as I think I've mentioned, that we can't make a grant to a private entity. So any wharfs that might be owned by private individuals, it makes it really, really challenging. But we're eager to be helpful. And so this is just the crux of the, you know, just a critical question for us. I recently heard about Booth Bay, and I'm just wondering if anyone else has heard about this, and maybe this is just a version of the land trust, where there was some property that was going up for sale, and they managed to actually very quickly create a not-for-profit and find donors very quickly who wanted to contribute and purchase the property. Now, I think partly what it took was a patient seller, and then of course resources that could be generated from philanthropic individuals right away. But I just didn't know if anybody else knew anything about that, and if it was very similar to some of the other, you know, land trust purchases. But I really hear you, Linda, about the speed. And how do we create a system where you know, government can't move that fast? Can philanthropy move fast enough? What does it take to be able to move very, very quickly? So, but again, my question, I guess, is if anyone's heard about the example from Booth Bay, which I think maybe well before COVID, actually.
Yeah, I think it was, you know, in the last couple of years, there have been 4 or 5 instances where property has come up for sale on the Coastal Working Waterfront property. And the folks in the Working Waterfront Coalition have gotten together to say, what can we do? There's been somebody in the community who says, this is a really important property. We need to save it. What are the options? And the answer is pretty grim. It's just like, if you don't have the money, if you're not in a community like Booth Bay where you can get together and raise the money and form a nonprofit to buy it. Like, there is no support in the system right now to prevent that. Of those properties, I think one hasn't sold, so still in the market, still an opportunity, still could go. One went to another business that was running it as a commercial fishing business, but it was very much up for question. It was a good location for doing something else too. Two went up for auction and were fortunately bought by community-minded individuals who said, let's keep this as infrastructure that supports our community. So I think similar to the Blue Bay Park, Blue Bay Maritime Foundation project you're talking about. And so where that happens, that's great, but how do we help create or foster a sense that that could happen in other places? Or the resources to do that? It's different to step into a distress sale or an emergency sale quickly with some funds, knowing you have a potential exit over the long term, than it is to just not buy it and wonder what you're gonna do with it.
Can you land bank authority do that though? So the legislature created a new land bank authority that they haven't technically funded yet, but in the process of potentially maybe thinking about funding. Just their language they're using, potentially maybe thinking about. But that tool is available. And there's a new executive director now there, and there's a board there. I wonder if they're not, what if we should at least reach out to them and think about if there's a role for them to play here? Because theoretically, this should be what they do, right? They should be a mechanism to mobilize to buy land for common purpose.
And maybe to do it in conjunction with any conflict is
Oh, Kurt,
sorry.
I'm just getting a cookie.
In Kurt's presentation, he talked about public education, right? That the working group is really talking about public education. And I think some of the things that we're talking about right now is so dependent on communities also having the resources, not just entities, but communities having the resources to be able to come together and have this conversation. You know, and what would it take for small grants to be given to communities to have these conversations that then they can represent themselves in bigger citywide conversations, infrastructure conversations, right? And what would it take to have infrastructure reconstruction and resilience committees across the state that are citizen run, right? I mean,
yeah, and or honestly, I mean, I think many of you know, we've talked about it today, I mean, our office runs the Community Resilience Partnership. We're in 226 towns. We're trying to get, you know, we have 480 something towns in Maine and trying to get all those towns to be proactively planning for climate and reducing emissions, but as they regularly plan, I mean, any working waterfront community, we would hope this would be at the top of their list. So thinking, I mean, we've used that program for sort of targeted grants as well. So.
And that's why I think there might be an opportunity where by providing the resources, going back to what you said and stuff, giving them, asking them what they can do, like giving them the opportunity to take those decisions, but giving them the structure to work with it, right? And the facilitation, maybe consulting support to put this at the forefront.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that's missing. I don't know. It just feels like they're going back to what you said. There's a piece there where it's also community engagement in a way that would make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, that's what we learned in Machias. They were looking for those sorts of resources too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say, I think, I mean, as we move into, Brian's, I'm sure already taking notes in our solution mode conversation. I mean, I'm struck by, I don't know if it was Pat and Kurt sort of spoke to this like Canadian model. And I do think, I mean, we need to think about communities. It could be public or private infrastructure, but there are more challenges to, you know, many private pieces of infrastructure. And it's hard to put public money into many, and we're not gonna ever stop doing that, probably, you know, at a local level and through economic development mechanisms. But if we're gonna invest in much more significant public working waterfront access, I do think those community conversations would be necessary. Because when I think about our dollars, like, could we invest in a couple of communities that really did want to go bigger, I mean, I don't know. Linda can tell me if I'm crazy, but she may be thinking about potentially the same thing in her town. I do just think this unique ability to put all this money into private working waterfront, I don't know if that will be, I mean, Pat, whether we'll be able to continue to do that. So if you have these public dollars for towns who want to build much more significant public waterfront that could change with changing species, changing businesses, that just seems more viable, but it will require community conversations, thinking about the properties that we could do this in. And again, so, I mean,
I
that's.
was just gonna say, if we're gonna call it the Canadian model, then you can attribute it to Pat.
But you
We
know.
need to come up with a state example.
First of all, I have two thoughts. One is, one of the things that I keep driving at is data acquisition, because I actually think there probably are a lot more conversations happening at the community level than we think and that we know about. And I think one of the things we want to address is how do we help not have people tripping all over ourselves? You know, where now we're initiating another process that's already been initiated, and there may be other entities, we know of a few that are, you know, nonprofits or institutions that are also having these conversations. And, you know, clearing it up so it doesn't look like we're, you know, you got the Island Institute and you have maybe Gulf of Maine Research, and you have, you know, I know that the Conservation Fund is thinking about it, and, you know, and getting everybody to the table so we can at least have a common message. So, because some of these communities, you know, are a completely volunteer government, and they pulled together in my town, there is a committee. Nobody on the committee has any experience in resiliency, but they're coming up with plans. And they're using some resources from the state, but they're using resources from anybody they can talk to. So somebody who was a partner at McKinsey is having a conversation with somebody at McKinsey for, you know, and it may be their recommendation to the volunteer government may be completely inconsistent with what we're. So I think it's, you know, if we can do anything, it's try to prevent that from going too far.
And I do think that you want to have stuff at the local level. And so Hannah, to your question, so Stonington actually working with the Island Institute as our technical support is, you know, had a series, a community conversation series last year that drew 100 people to each one of the things in the middle of the winter about sea level rise and about aquaculture and about these different topics. So I think community conversations, though, I think they're really, really important. How we bring standardized resources and information to those so that not everybody is just shooting for the same thing. Also, Stonington has a commercial fish pier, right, as well as individually owned and operated things. And it is one of the things that has made us more sustainable. We invested in that, you know, back in the 80s. So I do think that kind of investment, there are American models for that, not just Canadian models for that, and that's a really important kind of.
Oh, the Stonington
model. The Stonington model, I'm for it. This is the Stonington model.
Just to follow up on that, are you gonna go with the fish pier bonds?
Several of those thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna say that the fish piers, Rockland, Stonington, Jonesport, Portland, were all part of a package of a bond that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, in response to federal regulatory changes. And so that they were significant game-changing investments in coastal communities to support the working waterfront. That infrastructure has continued to play a variety of roles in supporting adaptation and resilience across the coast. And so that's an interesting model to be thinking more about.
Was it the Kelleher model?
There you go.
Did I say Canadian? Yeah, I just think I think to Dan's point, right? We have data needs, we have capacity needs. We need to kind of, I think, take a step back. We've left this period of controlled chaos after the storm, which is really what it was, right? But we had the Island Institute and the Coast Fishermen's Association put a lot of very small grants on the ground that really stabilized a lot of harbors, right? And we were not able to do that. So it's that side of philanthropy and fundraising really made a huge difference right out of the gate to get us to where we are. Because we were at a point where we were, thank God for a late shed, which very late shed now. If we had
You
seen
might need to tell everybody what you're even talking about, just in case.
the bolt of lobsters is happening late, so, if it had been a June timeframe, there were many harbors that would have been in really rough shape this year. But because it's now, they're just starting to crawl, and trap better than they, great places, like one of his places. You know, that nature has kind of gone back to almost a more normal phase from a lobster shed standpoint, which actually benefited the issues that we're dealing with on the ground. So I think now that we're leaving the control chaos, we start focusing on data needs, capacity issues. The grant will help with a lot of that. Some restructuring within state programs will hopefully be finalized in this next round, so there'll be more municipal focus. I think that will be beneficial for all of us as well. And then the idea of, I mean, that bonding piece that Nick just brought up, I think is something we really need to have a lot of conversation about, right? And that could benefit the Keller a lot.
Has a nice ring.
Judy, did you hear?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that one of the things we're leaving out here, and I'm gonna speak for you, Emily, because I think you're such a rock star in the work that you're doing, are the regional councils and the use that they have put. That's why I mentioned the coastal community grants earlier. When I say the design and the engineering, it's also the community conversations. That's what's funding the community conversations. It's the Shore and Harbor, Coastal Community, and the Community Resilience Partnership monies. And they're going to regional organizations and the regional coordinators that were funded originally by philanthropy 4 or 5 years ago. That money has run out, and the NOAA grant is bringing in funding to expand the network of regional coordinators from 4 to 10 or 11, I think, which is going to be a real game changer, especially in the low capacity communities. To have those community conversations, develop those visions, do the climate vulnerability assessments, do the action plans, and engage engineers on what I did in Washington County, because I mean, we heard today that Rockland is a small town of 7,000. Well, the largest city in Washington County is 3,000 people. Machias is 2,000 people. So when we did grants there, we would apply for a coastal community grant in order to get the design done for 5 towns in one grant. So we could get the engineers to even pay attention to an RFP for them to come out and bid and make it worth their while to come and do that work. So that regional coordination, I think, is going to make a huge difference in both the design and the community conversations.
I agree with Judy in that, you know, I don't know how many times at DOT we've been the first one in a community talking about sea level rise or resilience because we want to go up 4 feet of the bridge. And some of the towns you've mentioned today have had an absolute fit because it means we're going to change, you know, we're going to have to take some property to go up. You've got to go out, and the people have not been ready for that conversation. I don't think, I mean, I always say this, the DOT project manager is not the person to be having this conversation. I guarantee you of that. I mean, we're doing things like, don't listen to this, but, you know, can we build a bridge and figure out how to raise it 4 feet 25 years from now when people are, you know, can we build it in a way that we can raise the deck? Because why would we want to waste our resource and build something that we know we need to go higher? But I think the work you guys are doing, Brian, the councils are doing, we can't, there's no one else having those conversations in communities right now. And I can tell you, we're feeling the lack of that conversation big time, because it's a pull to get some of these communities to, maybe not so much since December and January, but to talk about climate and impact. So I just can't stress enough because I don't know how many times I've had to make a decision about, are we just not gonna go up now because people are furious, we're gonna have these property impacts, or what are we gonna do? So there are real decisions being made today because we haven't had the bigger conversations with communities.
I think Noel and then.
I still feel it's a bit of a disconnect, and maybe I'm not, well informed or like haven't caught up enough. I feel like there's still a bit of a disconnect where all this amazing work is happening in the communities. We have over 200 communities that we're connected to. And yet I feel like, people like Deborah from the philanthropic world are saying, and us too for that matter, saying that there aren't enough resources on the ground because we cannot give those resources to individuals or communities. And there's a disconnect there. If you have a network already, you have community coalitions, community conversations going on. Wouldn't it be, worth investing in, like the public education aspect of it that you mentioned from your group, to really get more people involved in that conversation, to kind of build up, as well as we're also looking at engineering projects and infrastructure projects, building resilience that way as well, to complement it. And I feel like there's a disconnect, and I just want to name it. I don't know why.
It's fragile. No, I think you're recognizing that it's fragile.
Yeah.
It's nascent. It's there, it's stretched thin,
Yeah.
but it's there. The bones are there.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just underscore that this NOAA grant will really, really help build what isn't, it's not serving everybody, but that's the network, I think. There's an efficiency in that network that I think gets to what you see as a gap.
Thank you.
I think Emily,
Yeah, I can just add to that. So, yes, I represent the regional planning organizations here on this committee, and we have been working incredibly hard, even well before January, but this past winter and spring, our office alone, which serves Lincoln County, which is 19 mostly coastal summit and communities, our biggest community is 5,000, just under 5,000. And we have written 18 grants in the past 6 months for towns. That is hundreds of percents above what we normally do. And most of those were written by 2 employees. So we're kind of tired. But we found that in a odd way, the January storms made it easier to start having these conversations with communities, and they have been more open to going after funding, which a lot of these funding sources, whether it's the Community Resilience Partnership, Shore and Harbor, coastal communities, there is a public engagement piece that you have to build into your scope of work to ensure that those conversations are happening. Because I think the agencies and funders recognize that if you don't have buy-in at the beginning of this process, you might not go well when it comes to trying to get something on the town meeting warrant to get people to actually approve it, to move it forward. The other work with the Community Resilience Partnership with the regional coordinators, which we also serve as a cohort in Region 1 with other RPOs, is one of our biggest focus was that outreach and engagement. So we actually created, all of the regional coordinators across the state created what's called a Building Stronger Communities workshop series. So at least once a month over the course of about a 1.5 year period, we were hosting webinars online. They're all recorded. They're all on YouTube if you want to watch them. And it was on different aspects of resilience, whether it's social vulnerabilities, nature-based solutions, retreat, things like electrification and energy, and so we had CMP work with us to do a presentation on what they're doing in terms of electrification. We worked with the energy office to talk about what's happening at the state level with energy. We've had communities present on projects they're working on, and it has been a good collaboration that has seen significant communities come together, even across geographical boundaries, to say, here's what we're doing, or this might work. And so I think, to your point earlier, we were talking about this regional scale of projects coming together that might make it easier to apply for dollars and or get contractors in. That basis is there, and I think this commission can come up with recommendations to build that up.
So you see the rock star.
So, a couple comments. First of all, I agree with Joyce that we were at the meeting in Old Orchard Beach, and there was a discussion about a roadway going through the salt marsh. And so we talked about raising it, and somebody said, no, you can't do that, because when you raise the road, you push the shoulders out, and that would affect the salt marsh. Well, that's a difficult conversation. It has to be had across the board. Second point I would make is, I don't see private investment funding these projects. Private investment is done to make a return on investment, and it's most of the economic impact on the waterfront. A lot of it is seasonal. It's really hard to make those numbers work. So I don't think you can count on that. I think, I'm kind of thinking that if you can select areas, certain areas of the state where you can invest in resilient infrastructure that services a fairly large number of people, maybe town by town or community by community, that's where the biggest bang for the buck is going to be. And if you can reform permitting, I may mention that casually before. You can do some of those reform, maybe permit reforms, maybe just make things simpler and easier to attract contractors and investors. I think those would be good steps. So, my thoughts.
Jack's definitely in the what recommendations are emerging for you. So I feel like everybody should jump in because I think we're trying for our staff team and for Sam, who's also working with our staff team, to try to ensure that we sort of have big ideas out there that you want staff to keep working on over the next couple of months to bring back to this commission to be refined. I don't know, Brian, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I've been filling in notes based on these questions, and so, look over those notes to make sure that we're capturing it the right way. Keep the discussion going for a couple minutes longer.
Well, I'll jump in. So, Jack, when I was talking about private investment, I think you're absolutely right. There's likely not going to be the investment to do the projects. I think there is an opportunity to have sort of outside sources of capital, mostly philanthropic, that aren't looking for a return, help invest in the capacity building. Because clearly, the problems we're facing, the one advantage Maine may have is that every coastal community in the entire United States is facing the same issue. And there is no model yet anywhere in the United States that is shown to work. I will say, having some contracting experience in Florida, Florida's way ahead, but if you overlaid the Florida rules on Maine, you'd have a major revolution. I mean, in Florida, you can't build a new home anywhere in a coastal zone that's below 16 feet above sea level. So every home is on stilts, and commercial structures as well. And it sort of makes people that don't believe in being told how they should do things kind of crazy. And so some of this will get to, we're going to have to be uncomfortable in suggesting there need to be some systemic changes, many which will be positive. I mean, personal anecdote, when Proc did a project for me that was right at the end of the St. George River marine zone, and at the beginning of the river zone, I had one of those windows, which was like 6 months, because there was the alewives and there was the striped bass and there was the, we had to end up doing that in a really compressed period of time to get it done. And that's kind of aggravating. There's got to be a workaround there. And mostly that was not the state of Maine. That was the federal government. But I'm still more today than I was, before on this sort of, we need the data. We just need, we need the map. We need a, interactive way to say, okay, if Stonington really wants to be, finish the job of being resilient, this is, okay, here are the roads, here are the electric lines, here are the wharves, here are the public wharves, here are the private wharves, and okay, that's the magnitude of the problem. And if you could do it everywhere on the coast, I believe it's probably not as hard a problem to solve as we think it is. And maybe Sam, you've done this because there's so much available data. I mean, you could probably do it on Google Maps, you know, and get most of the data if you could just sit enough people, engineers in a room and say, okay, everything below this elevation and every, you know, I'm sure that CMP has a really good list of all their lines. And so that's data that exists. It's a big compilation effort. I think that would be extraordinarily helpful in then selling, okay, well, what our recommendations are, because I don't think anybody, I think we are a unique group. We're looking at the system, this is a systemic issue across the state. Every community is thinking it's only them. And, you know, to get this to be a, you know, to understand there has to be a statewide response, and there are going to be some statewide things, maybe great on permitting. I for one also believe there may be ways to solve the private side of this that we're not thinking of. You know, are there revenue streams that can be created for a third party owner? You know, we did the working waterfront legislation a while ago. Land for Maine Futures has been buying land forever. There are 2 or 3 really big organizations that do conservation easements. Can you create a marine conservation easement that perhaps the sellers get additional tax benefit from the state for doing that? Because working waterfronts, you know, that's a revenue stream. There are probably other revenue streams if you were allowed to ever convert to some light commercial use that isn't necessarily part of today's definition of working waterfront, but could help pay back the easement or the diminished value. So I think we really should explore how you can monetize a private sector approach to some of this stuff.
I see Pete's hand up on the screen, so I want to make sure.
Oh, good.
It's him.
Yeah, thanks all. Sorry, I have a cold, so good thing I'm not there. I've been really sitting and listening and thinking a lot about the conversation here. And one of the things that resonates with me in terms of the discussion is the condition of a lot of the facilities that we're talking about vary significantly. And therefore, their ability to actually be resilient varies significantly. I mean, some of these facilities were really old and in no way could withstand what we saw in January. So it got me thinking a little bit about a project that we actually did with Island Institute and in Penobscot Bay that actually standardized the methodology to look at the vulnerability and condition of working waterfront infrastructure. So I think that was developed in a transferable way so it could be implemented almost anywhere. I think that might be an interesting thing for us to dig into a little bit because again, I think condition is really important as to how well some of these pieces of infrastructure are actually going to handle flooding, waves, and things like that. And that gets a little bit to the data question that we've been discussing. Another thought is, it seems to me like one of the things that would be a good recommendation is to really work on formalizing partnerships and networks, not only for long-term recovery, but short-term recovery after these storm events. So I'm thinking of debris cleanup, for instance. I mean, there was a lot of debris that was created in our coastal communities from these 2 storms that had to be cleaned up. And I don't know how the individual private wharves dealt with that, just cleaned it up on their own. Did they have already something in place with contractors to help with cleanup? Did municipalities have formalized partnerships in place with, you know, trash companies or whoever? So I think a lot of formalized networks in terms of that and including contracting community in that would be very, very important for us to think about in terms of a recommendation. And a final one, and this might be this might be a long shot, but I was kind of thinking about funding. And one of the programs that I think is really interesting in Maine that may relate to this in some way, if we can structure it right, is the in lieu fee program. And that's based on impact for filling wetlands. But what I was thinking of from this standpoint, and Dan touched on this a little bit, is if there's new commercial residential development going into a community, is there something, could this fund be structured in a way so that there's an impact fee or whatever that goes into this fund? Or maybe it's an additional fee that is placed on new commercial and residential development of a certain size, redevelopment, et cetera, that then can be used in working waterfront communities to help fund some of this privates, because these funds would be available to private wharves in my mind, because they'd be paid into by commercial and private residential development. So just another thought that I had out there in terms of maybe an interesting way to maybe think about possibly funding this. And again, I'm sure that's a very basic thought and really needs to be worked into more. And this is a long-term fund, not something that I think could be implemented right away. So just a couple thoughts on what I've heard today. Thanks.
Partially answer Pete's question. Maine Coast Fishermen's Association did a bunch of work with contractors on debris cleanup and communities, and so I think they probably have pretty good knowledge and understanding of what was happening, and that's probably the closest we have as a network. The other thing to note on the tax credit side, Senator King introduced a working waterfront resilience tax credit late last week, and so that would incentivize private investments of up to $1 million in resilience upgrades to working waterfronts. You get a 30% tax credit, so possible revenue stream there if that goes forward. Possibly to think about at the state, less rich at the state level, but useful.
Yeah, we haven't actually talked that debris cleanup question. I know DEP got a lot of it. I remember hearing a lot of legislators ask who's going to help, and MEMA was dealing with it, and there really is no answer. I mean, we're talking more about the working waterfront today, but honestly, all the broken up working waterfront was washing up, and the municipalities were dealing with it, and ferries were running into it. We had like marine sort of navigation issues for a few days, but
Yes, okay. I think we're talking about when Dan, you said, maybe private sector, there could be investment, private investment there, if you can incentivize that. One of the things that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement is the philanthropic community came together to really reevaluate how they were funding projects across the country. You definitely saw that in Maine, like all philanthropic entities, small family foundations, big foundations came together, and they really revamped how they were doing funding across the board. And I wonder if this is an opportunity for us, and this is the big idea here. I'm not sure it's a good idea, but the kind of higher level ideas. Can we initiate those conversations with big private funders and foundations to kind of really say, what would this collaboration, public-private foundation collaboration look like to get to these goals, to these big goals, and for us to take the lead on that and to kind of initiate that conversation?
I mean, I think that's a great question for Deborah, in that I think we were hoping that this commission, I mean, obviously most of the funding and most of the energy is going to come from state and federal funding sources, but philanthropy can play a pretty important role, and we have heard a lot of interest. I don't know, Deborah, if you want to say anything more to Noel's point, but.
And just before Deborah answers, like, isn't it true, Deborah, that there are many individuals who are also really wanting to donate and support resiliency conversations since January and maybe the last few years? A lot more. I've seen that in my family, like more investments, like, yeah, sorry.
You're on mute, Deborah. Sorry.
Sorry, I've only been doing this for 4 years. Sure, yeah, we absolutely have seen private funders immediately following the storms, and so yeah, we're again really interested in supporting donors who are interested in this. Yes, interested in the equity conversation. So just really grateful to be part of the conversation, and where we might fit in the solution, also recognizing that, yeah, the bulk of this is probably public sector, but even can we help moving in that direction? So really eager for any kind of thought of where philanthropy best fits and how we can encourage donors to step up.
Lionel, I would say that one of the other things, having spent a lot of time in philanthropy, is it's also another data point. I don't think right now we know who in that world is playing in the state of Maine. Or even further, who in that world is playing on a national basis and is just looking for a place to turn into a model.
Yep.
There's some huge foundations out there investing robustly in climate change, ocean level rise, a bunch of the issues we've landed on. And interestingly enough, years ago, the Maine lobster fishery was considered one of the first industries to acknowledge sea level rise and sea level warming. So it's kind of been at the center of this, but I'm not sure we've gathered the appropriate amount of inertia to really galvanize that sort of that network around us.
One thing I might want to add is, as a community foundation is made up of many different donors. It's not like a Ford Foundation, so it's a little bit different. So we have some donors who are contributing through donor advised funds on a regular basis. When we surveyed them about I guess almost 2 years now, but the issue that is most important to them, climate was number one. And so I think there is real interest, and also, Dan, I've been talking with a bunch of folks, and yeah, as you know, this is something folks care about and would like to be helpful. So, but I agree, a formal data analysis would be excellent.
Yeah, and especially, I just want to put another point in there to include in that data analysis, like the size of the towns and who can afford to do a one-to-one match, who can afford to put out front the federal dollars against a $1.5 million grant, who can afford to do these things, and how do we support those communities so they can actually access that public money, and use that public money effectively. I think that's a super important thing in terms of equity that we have to really think about, because we have so many small.
And if philanthropy can help with and forgive me if I'm interrupting people, I can't quite hear, but if philanthropy can help with the speed and help with the flexibility and help with gaps between what government can do, that's a great role for us.
So
to something that Peter said, one other comment, sorry, Dan, is that okay?
Yeah, one.
Yeah. That if we're running out of time, I do.
Well, I was going to do a closing, but if it's quick,
very quick.
Real quick.
Going back to what Peter said around like communities having very different realities across the Maine coast, and their preparedness for resilience is also very different. Would it make sense to kind of look at a toolkit of sorts, that knowing that it could be very different based on the community, that we could develop or support the development of, and then communities can then use that?
Yeah, no, and honestly, I will say the NOAA grant that we talked about has funding that could support that kind of activity. And similar to what Emily's group has started to do, but to continue to formalize that. Love it.
So mindful of the time, we promised to get everybody out of here by 4 o'clock. And I'll just reflect and then turn it over to Linda to close the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for being here. This is, I think, our largest commission meeting in person that we've had. And I think it's, I know this conversation could have gone on for a lot longer if we wanted it to. Just in terms of our cadence, we're going to take a break for the rest of August. We are going to pick our schedule back up in September. We have 2 meetings scheduled for September. One is on the 4th and the other the 18th. 2 meetings in October. I'd love to get, either to me or Linda or to Hannah or Brian, feedback on this format. I think, this is the second meeting on this format we've had. Or just to remind people that we owe the governor an interim report by sometime in November and final report in May. And we're, I think, at least I'm hearing from last meeting to this, that we're starting to galvanize around a number of major topics. I'm not going to recount them because they may be slightly different, but I think, we keep hearing about data, we keep hearing about capacity, we keep hearing about definitions, and permitting, lack of money. Those are common, and I'm not sure, common themes, I'm not sure there are any surprise, but I am quite energized about, those are sort of the common themes around a number of things, but then we really have the opportunity to get a leg up and really develop a strategy for the governor around how we can really proceed in a meaningful way and have this be lasting, for years into the future, because we know that this, what we're dealing with is only going to be accelerating over time. If you have other ideas for topics that we want to cover, in how we, either issues that we haven't discussed and gotten to the table today, or how we might want to shape our recommendations. The format of the report hasn't been even started for discussion, I suspect. We'll start discussing that in September. As I said, I think we're going to have a longer meeting in September to vet and prioritize our recommendations. I again want to give a huge nod of appreciation to Brian and his team, because there's, as you can imagine, it's not just scheduling these meetings and getting everything, the agendas, and bringing in the public officials when we have a site visit, but there's just a huge amount of background work after between each one of these. It's not just note taking; it's deep assimilation and research into what's really going on. So thank you guys for doing that. I'm going to turn it over to Linda to reflect and have a nice summer.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate how much you emphasize the speed and the urgency and the specifics with which we need to work. So we're going to get to take the rest of August off, but just as with the flow of money and the way that and how fast the climate is changing, we have to be able to work fast. So we have to be able to come to these meetings really prepared with specifics so that we can get those recommendations out in November. I want to make sure that in terms of public funding, two things we didn't mention today, that I think are super important in terms of municipalities, FEMA funding and the just how that all works. I see Pete up there on the screen, and insurance. I mean, and we didn't really get to talk about those two pieces of public funding, but we really need to make sure that they're in the mix for our recommendations. You all will be delighted to hear that I am racing back to Stonington to take part in a public engagement this evening around a coastal communities grant program and an SHMP grant program that is helping Stonington to do its shorefront planning. And that got scheduled on the same day as this meeting. So that community engagement is alive and well. And I know Judy's been part of this. I know other people have been part of this. If you see that happening in your community, and you haven't been to one of those engagements, please go, because you'll get a front row seat at how this planning is working or not working. Both at the same time, mostly at the same
We
time.
hope you get one and not the other.
Yeah, that's why I'm racing back. But we want to thank again the Island Institute, all of you individually and together who have been so supportive of today and of all of the other efforts for our coastal communities. Thank you. And again, thanks to Hannah and Brian and the team, because we can't say enough about that's what's the engine making this whole thing go. So we're going to keep being out there in the world, Dan and I, saying that our work is important and urgent. We hope all of you are as well. So thank you all for such a great job showing up today and participating, and thank you to our guests. And we'll see you very soon. September is always here before you know it. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ken.
So
Good to see you.
Sure, I like that.
Well, we know we did have a bunch of segments that's to include, but no,